Dumbledore reaches for the ring. The shack is rotting and full of whispers. Floorboards sigh under his boots, dust hangs in the air like ash, and a damp metallic chill clings to the broken stones of the Gaunt house, as if the walls themselves remember every curse ever shouted here. On a warped table, half swallowed by cobwebs and moonlight, lies a ring, black, cracked, and humming with a faint, oppressive magic that presses against the skin before it's ever touched. Albus Dumbledore stands alone in the ruin, not the silver-bearded general of Half-Blood Prince, but younger, less worn, his hair still more auburn than white, his robes travel-stained rather than hospital-faded. This is years before Harry Potter, before the boy who lived walks through the doors of Hogwarts, before the war feels inevitable. His hand hovers over the ring, fingers trembling in a way that has nothing to do with age. What if Dumbledore's greatest mistake didn't happen at the end of a long life, but right here, right now, when the board is only just being set? In canon, he waits, he investigates, he calculates, he resists the temptation until it breaks through his legendary self-control. But this isn't a story about restraint winning. This is a story about the one temptation he has always feared most arriving too early, when his hope is still raw, when his guilt over Ariana's death still feels like a fresh wound instead of an old scar. The ring is a horcrux, yes, but the stone set within it is something more profound. The resurrection stone, the second hallow, the promise of voices he has spent a lifetime trying not to hear. He sees Ariana first, not as she died, but as she might have been, laughing somewhere just out of reach, a flash of dark hair and shy eyes in the corner of his mind. He hears Aberforth's anger echoing through the years, every accusation that he chose glory over family, and behind them, like a shadow cast by a brighter flame, Grindelwald, brilliant, beautiful, terrible, the boy who matched him, idea for idea and dream for dream, the love that collapsed under the weight of ideology and blood. We're exploring the moment when all of that longing, all of that regret, gathers in his chest and tips the scales. His fingers close around the ring. He actually slides it onto his hand. The curse hits instantly. Black fire explodes from the band, racing up his arm like living ink, searing through flesh and bone. He staggers, slamming into the ruined wall, ancient plaster cracking under the impact as his knees buckle. The air smells of burned wood and burned skin. His wand clatters uselessly away, light sputtering out, and then the dead arrive. Ariana flickers into being at his side, translucent, eyes wide with something that might be forgiveness or might be accusation. Aberforth stands behind her, jaw clenched, his outline wavering like candlelight in a draft. Grindelwald appears last, of course he does, leaning in with that familiar half-smile, the one that always meant danger and destiny together, comfort and horror blur, love and punishment intertwined, as Dumbledore reaches out with his unburned hand, desperate, choking, already dying. If this is where he falls, years before Harry ever receives his Hogwarts letter, what happens to the boy who lived? If the man playing chess with Voldemort starts the game knowing he has only a few moves left, how does that rewrite Harry's entire story, the war against Voldemort, and most importantly, the meaning of sacrifice itself? Not a rejection of canon, why this what-if matters. So what do we actually do with that image? Dumbledore on the floor of the Gaunt shack, the curse racing up his arm years too early. We don't throw out canon. We lean into it. This isn't a story about replacing J.K. Rowling's text with something better. This is a story about reading the same canon more closely, then asking what if one crucial timing choice shifts? The ring is still a horcrux. The stone is still the resurrection stone. Dumbledore is still the man who waits too long to confess his own weakness. We're exploring how the emotional truth of his arc changes when the countdown begins earlier, not inventing a different wizarding world from scratch. So let's anchor ourselves in what the books actually give us. Canonically, the Gaunt ring lies buried in the ruins of the Gaunt shack, steeped in Marvolo's obsession and Tom Riddle's hatred. It is both a fragment of Voldemort's soul and one of the Deathly Hallows, the resurrection stone, etched with the Hallows symbol that once dazzled a young Albus Dumbledore. When he finally finds it, long after Voldemort's return, he recognizes it as a horcrux, knows it must be destroyed, and still, he slips it on, just for a moment, out of a longing to see his family again. That moment is everything. The curse blackens his hand, Snape slows but cannot stop it, and from that point on, Dumbledore is living on borrowed time. In canon, this happens late, once Harry already knows about Voldemort's return, once the war is fully declared. Our what if simply asks, what if that same failure of judgment, born of love and guilt, happens much earlier in the saga, because Dumbledore's temptation is not abstract. It is Ariana on the floor, it is Aberforth's fury, it is Grindelwald's face in the firelight, and the boy he once was, who believed they could master death together. The Resurrection Stone offers not power in battle, but the seduction of lost love, the promise of one more conversation, one more chance at atonement. How does a man who has always preached the greater good respond when the past he ran from stands within reach of his unburned hand? We'll examine 3 intertwined themes as we move through this timeline. First, guilt and atonement. If Dumbledore is dying in secret from the very start, every lesson he gives Harry becomes an apology he can never quite voice. Second, the difference between planning a war and living inside a countdown to death. Strategy looks different when you know you will not be there for the final move. Third, the lure of the dead. What happens to his calm, twinkling persona when he can always feel the stone calling him back to Ariana, to his parents, to something more profound than public victory? If you watched What If Harry and Hermione Fell in Love, you know the style we're returning to. Dramatic, intimate, analytical. We stay close to the characters in their smallest moments, Harry in the common room, Snape in his dungeon, Dumbledore alone in his office, and then pull back to see how those private choices reshape the war. We trace not just what changes on the battlefield, but what shifts in the private bonds that hold these people together. Most importantly, the stakes of this what if are not about spectacle, they are about meaning. If Dumbledore is marked for death from year 1, then every secret he keeps from Harry, every half-truth he tells Snape, every calculated sacrifice he orchestrates becomes sharper, riskier, almost romantic in its tragic self-denial. He is no longer the distant chess master who might live to see the endgame. He is the dying general who chooses to spend his last years turning a frightened boy into someone who can walk into the forest alone. So what changes when that countdown starts early? Does Harry learn about horcruxes sooner or too late? Does Snape accept a mission he knows will end in the headmaster's death, or does his own bond with Lily's memory fracture under the pressure? Does the Order of the Phoenix become a movement built around Dumbledore's presence or his absence? In the next section, we'll step back to year 1 and watch how a single cursed ring, quietly claiming its victim, begins to rewire every connection at Hogwarts. Thesis and Roadmap, a war planned on borrowed time. So here is the heart of our experiment. What if Dumbledore put on the Gaunt ring, not in the quiet, reflective years before Half-Blood Prince, but almost as soon as Voldemort fell? What if the man we always imagined as the patient chess master began this war already dying, already hearing his sister's voice every time he closed his eyes? That is our thesis. Moving the Gaunt ring incident earlier doesn't just shift a date on a timeline, it turns Dumbledore's long, elegant strategy into a desperate, time-limited gambit. Every piece must move faster, every ally must be brought in closer. Every lie he tells Harry, Snape, and the Order has to be sharper, more honest in its cruelty, or the whole board collapses before Harry even reaches the Chamber of Secrets. To trace that transformation, we're exploring 4 main fault lines. First, Dumbledore's emotional landscape under the Resurrection Stone's influence. A man who can actually see Ariana, hear his mother, almost touch the echo of Grindelwald's young face, and who has to choose, again and again, to come back to the living. Second, his mentorship of Harry. How does a headmaster who knows he might not live to see year 4 teach a boy who is, in canon, protected by time? Third, Snape's altered mission. What happens when the unbreakable vow, the promise to watch over the boy, and the task of slowing a lethal curse all collide years too early? And finally, the ripple effects on Horcrux and Hallows strategy when the person holding the most dangerous secrets in the world knows he will not always be there to explain them. Structurally, this isn't a story about random butterflies. This is a story about eras. We'll start in the fragile calm after Voldemort's first fall, when Dumbledore finds the Gaunt shack, recognizes the ring as a Horcrux and a Hallow, and in a single reckless moment of love and regret, puts it on. From there, we'll move through each Hogwarts year. A year 1, where the stone tempts him in the mirror room. A year 2, where the diary and the chamber unfold under the shadow of his failing hand. A year 3, where Sirius's fate hangs in the balance of how much truth Dumbledore is finally willing to share. All of it building to an endgame where he may not live to see the Battle of Hogwarts at all. To keep us grounded, we'll alternate modes. We'll slip into close-up dramatized scenes. Dumbledore alone in his office, turning the ring, whispering whispering Ariana's name, Dumbledore with Harry at King's Cross, not as a post-mortem vision, but as a last, living conversation. Then, we'll step back, and we'll examine how each altered moment reshapes the war, the Order's cohesion, and Harry's inner life. His trust, his anger, his sense of whether Dumbledore's love was something more profound than strategy, something worth fighting for even after betrayal. And through it all, one question will haunt every era. With less time, does Dumbledore finally choose brutal honesty with Harry, laying out horcruxes and hallows, while there is still breath in his body? Or does he double down on manipulation, because he is terrified of losing control of the outcome, and of losing Harry, the last boy he dares to love? In the next section, we'll step into that first altered era and watch the curse bloom on his hand the night he claims the ring. Dumbledore's love story with the dead. The curse blooms, black and merciless, but before it reaches his heart, something else does. A ring, a stone, a promise he was never meant to touch. What if, in this altered timeline, that touch doesn't just mark the beginning of his death, but the beginning of a love story with the dead? Because this isn't a story about Dumbledore the kindly headmaster, twinkling over lemon drops and house cups. This is a story about two different kinds of love tearing him in half. On one side, the comfortable, institutional love, Hogwarts as his great, safe romance, the Order of the Phoenix as his chosen family, the place where he can pour out care in staff meetings, in secret protections, in the way he always makes sure the students go home for Christmas alive. On the other side, something more profound and far more dangerous. The fierce, forbidden love braided with Ariana's broken life and Grindelwald's bright, terrible smile. Canon gives us only flashes of that second love, but they are sharp. The way his voice changes when he finally speaks of Ariana in King's Cross, soft and wrecked. The hesitation, the catch, when he says Grindelwald's name, as if every syllable is a reopened wound. We're exploring what happens when the Resurrection Stone presses those half-buried moments into the present, not in Deathly Hallows, but years earlier, when his self-control is still his favorite illusion. In his palm, the stone becomes a lover's whisper. It offers him the one thing Hogwarts never can, the illusion of closure. One more conversation with his sister, one more night standing beside Grindelwald without the world on fire, one more chance at forgiveness he has never actually allowed himself to imagine. How do you resist a Hallows artifact that doesn't just promise power, but the fantasy that the worst night of your life can be rewritten if you just turn it 3 times? So we watch him linger. That's our motif. Small gestures, repeated until they feel like vows. Dumbledore alone in his office, the stone resting against his lifeline, his thumb circling it as if memorizing the shape of regret, half-formed apologies breathing into the air. Ariana, I should have... Gellert, if only we had, names that no one else hears, because the portraits are pretending to sleep. He begins to touch his ruined hand, the way a widower touches a wedding band, a reflexive, helpless caress of the curse that binds him to his own guilt. And while he walks the corridors, loving Hogwarts in the daylight, he is engaged to ghosts at night. That is the central tension we'll examine next. Can a man in love with the dead still love the living world enough to save it? Or does every brilliant plan, every sacrifice he asks of Harry and Snape and the Order, become a way of writing his own tragic love letter to the past, choosing, again and again, to die with them instead of fully living without them? Most importantly, if the dead are always in the room with him now, what happens when the living finally notice? From abstract to concrete, locking in our alternate timeline. So let's stop hovering in the abstract and finally name the fracture point. In canon, Dumbledore spends years knowing about the Gaunt shack, suspecting what lies there, and yet he waits. He waits until after Order of the Phoenix, after the Ministry battle, after Sirius has fallen through the veil, before he goes to that ruin, finds the Gaunt ring, recognizes the Resurrection Stone, and in a single unguarded moment of love and weakness, puts it on. The curse bites, Snape contains it, and the clock starts counting down in Harry's 6th year. But what if that moment comes far earlier, not with a war already raging again, but in the uneasy quiet that follows the first one? We're exploring a timeline where, in the late 1980s, while the wizarding world is still celebrating Voldemort's fall and pretending the nightmare is over, Albus Dumbledore is doing what he always does, walking into the shadows alone. He has the Elder Wand. He has suspicions that Voldemort, with his obsession with relics and immortality, would have gone back to his ancestral home, and this time, instead of delaying, he acts. He tracks the Gaunt line to its end. He enters the shack while the ministry files gather dust. He finds the ring on that cracked stone table, feels the Hallows symbol carved into its face, and understands in one terrible, extraordinary heartbeat what it actually is, not just a horcrux, the resurrection stone. The one Hallow that speaks directly to his oldest, most unhealed wound. This isn't a story about a wise old headmaster calmly charting a decade of lesson plans for the chosen one. This is a story about a man who has just realized that his dead sister, his broken family, and the boy he once loved might be one turn of a ring away. He knows better. He always knew better, and he still puts it on. The curse tears through him years before Harry ever steps onto platform 9 3/4. Snape is summoned much earlier, forced into the same desperate containment, the same promise. The curse is unstoppable, only delayable, and Dumbledore's life has been brutally shortened. But now that ticking clock begins in the late 1980s, not the mid-1990s. Which means every choice he makes about Harry's childhood, about the rebuilt Order of the Phoenix, about when to reveal Horcruxes and Hallows, is made while he is already dying and already haunted by the stone's whispering presence. So how do we lock this in, concretely, rather than floating in vague doom? We'll examine the series year by year. Harry in the cupboard, Harry in the Mirror of Erist, Harry in the Chamber of Secrets, the Diary, the Basilisk, Sirius Black's escape, the rebirth of the Order, all under the pressure of a headmaster whose judgment is subtly, relentlessly warped by nightly conversations with the dead. Most importantly, we're not just changing when Dumbledore dies, we're changing how he lives while he still can. So, let's step back to the night Voldemort fell and watch what happens when the man who was supposed to guide Harry to the Endgame starts dying before the story even begins. Night after Godric's Hollow, a different Dumbledore decides. The street is quiet, Privet Drive wrapped in that strange, breathless stillness that follows catastrophe. In canon, this is the night of relief. The night of lemon drops and quiet chuckles as Dumbledore tells McGonagall that the boy will be famous, that the Dark Lord is gone, that perhaps, just perhaps, the worst is over. But what if, beneath those half-moon spectacles, there's already a shadow? What if the hand that lifts Harry's blanket has bones laced with cursed fire, hidden beneath immaculate robes and a carefully transfigured glove? He stands by the Dursleys' hedge, a fraction too long. McGonagall sees a twinkle. She doesn't see the wince when the wind brushes fabric against ruined skin. Hagrid's tears soak Harry's blanket. Dumbledore's eyes are bright for another reason. He has read the prophecy. He has watched Voldemort fall. In canon, he allows himself fragile hope. Here, there is something more profound threaded through that hope. The cold, precise knowledge that he is already dying. This boy will be famous, he still says, but in his mind, the sentence finishes differently. Famous, and I may never see what he becomes. When the street is empty and the cat has slipped away, we follow him not to a cozy office full of sherbet lemons and whimsical nonsense, but to a sanctuary that suddenly feels too large. The ring lies on his desk, cracked where he forced Gryffindor's sword through the Horcrux, the black stone gleaming like a promise and a threat. His hand, blackened and bound in enchanted bandages, shakes as he turns the stone once. Ariana appears. She is not quite solid, not quite ghost, but close enough that his breath catches. This isn't a story about clever old wizards and tidy plans. This is a story about a brother who never stopped loving the sister he failed. He doesn't ask her about Grindelwald, or about the Hallows, or even about the ring that dragged him back to her. He asks silently if he has done right by another child, leaving him there. He whispers to the empty room, to the girl who died in a different one. With them. In canon, the decision to leave Harry with the Dursleys is about blood protection, about ancient magic and Lily's sacrifice. That still matters, but now we're exploring a second, harsher calculus. Harry must learn to survive without Dumbledore, because Dumbledore can no longer pretend he'll always be there. The cupboard under the stairs becomes, in his mind, a brutal training ground, neglect that will harden, loneliness that will drive Harry toward connection when he finally reaches Hogwarts. Is it right? Is it monstrous? He doesn't know. He only knows he will not have 17 years to correct his mistakes. So the butterfly effect begins quietly. While the wizarding world celebrates, Dumbledore is already mapping memories, tracing Tom Riddle's path from the Gaunt shack to the diary to the locket. He cannot assume decades to unravel Voldemort's immortality. The ring's curse has turned every unanswered question into an emergency. He sits, at last, and pulls a piece of parchment toward him. His wand moves in practiced strokes, but the quill trembles when it reaches the salutation. To an old student, a man he once trusted, then condemned, then used. Severus. The glove on his ruined hand creaks softly as he signs his name, sealing a letter that, in canon, he would not need for many years. Here, their fates will be tied much sooner. The phoenix on its perch stirs, sensing the shift, as Dumbledore's gaze lingers on the ring one last time. And as the candle burns low, we are left with a single, unsettling question. What exactly has he just asked Severus Snape to do? Snape's mission starts early, a different, unbreakable vow. The classroom is empty, the candles low, and for once even the portraits seem to be holding their breath. What if the conversation that defines Severus Snape's life doesn't happen on a freezing tower in Half-Blood Prince, but here, years earlier, in a shadowed room that still smells faintly of potion smoke and fear? Snape steps through the door at Dumbledore's summons, expecting reprimand, negotiation, leverage. What he finds instead is Dumbledore seated at a desk, his right hand wrapped in shimmering silver bandages that pulse faintly with contained darkness. The old man looks older than Snape has ever seen him, not weak, but finite. When Dumbledore unwraps the hand and lets Snape see the blackened, cracked skin beneath, the air itself tightens. This is no ordinary curse. Snape recognizes, instantly, magic designed to kill and to keep killing. Here is where the canon line bends. In the original timeline, Snape's slow recruitment into Dumbledore's long game leaves him always half in shadow, half in doubt. Here, there is no time for that. Dumbledore tells him, plainly, that the curse will end his life within a few short years, that even Snape's considerable skill can only slow it, never break it. The supposed invincible protector of Hogwarts is dying, and he is asking Severus to look at the clock with him. We're exploring a Snape who is not eased into loyalty, but slammed into it. What does it do to him to realize that the man he has come to rely on as shield and judge, as the only one who believes in his remorse, is already marked for death? This isn't a story about a reluctant double agent dragged along by circumstance. This is a story about a man being told, from almost the beginning, that he will have to finish the war without the only person he trusts. So the unbreakable vow changes shape. Instead of Narcissa's desperate bargain years later, we'll examine an earlier, colder, more deliberate ritual between headmaster and spy. Dumbledore offers his own magic, his own life force, as anchor. Snape swears not only to protect the boy who lived, but to guide him, to hunt horcruxes in Dumbledore's name, to carry the secret of the Hallows and the burden of the cursed hand's ticking clock. The vow does not command a single killing blow. It commands endurance, secrecy, and most importantly, a promise to keep Harry alive long enough to understand why he must die. In that moment, their bond becomes something more profound than simple obedience. Snape is no longer a pawn shuffled across the board. He is a co-strategist, a man invited into the terrible beauty of Dumbledore's impossible plan. The loyalty that grows from this is almost romantic in its tragedy. Two brilliant, broken men choosing together to sacrifice themselves for a boy who will never fully understand them. And if Snape has been carrying the knowledge of Dumbledore's death, the weight of that vow, since before Harry ever steps into the Great Hall, how does that reshape every glare, every insult, every intervention? Does he become harsher, more brittle, flaying Harry with words because love terrifies him and responsibility enrages him? Or does he become, in strange, fleeting moments, more protective than canon ever allowed, because on some level he knows he is all Harry will have when the headmaster's cursed hand finally stills? The stones whisper. Does Dumbledore heal or fracture? So what happens when the man who is all Harry will have starts spending his nights with those Harry can never meet? What if the headmaster who terrifies and protects in equal measure is, in truth, haunted, and chooses the haunting? Dumbledore does not use the stone once. He uses it again and again and again. In this timeline, the Gaunt ring is on his finger years earlier, the curse slowed by Snape, the resurrection stone humming at the edge of every quiet moment. In his office, the portraits pretend to sleep while Ariana hovers in the corner of his vision, always just out of reach. A younger Aberforth leans against the mantel, eyes blazing with the accusation Dumbledore remembers too well. Grindelwald, not the broken prisoner of Nurmengard, but the brilliant boy with burning ideals, stands by the window, offering plans they once whispered together. Each encounter is a knife turned. Each conversation feels like love and punishment fused. We're exploring two possible trajectories, and both are dangerous. In the first, the stone becomes a brutal therapist. Forced to face Ariana's silence, Aberforth's disappointment, Grindelwald's seduction of power, Dumbledore actually begins to process what he has always buried. He listens. He apologizes out loud, over and over, to people who cannot truly answer. And because he hears his own words, because he finally confronts what he did and failed to do, he walks into Harry's first year more emotionally honest than in canon. This isn't a story about a perfect man. This is a story about a man who has already broken in private, and so feels less need to control in public. In that path, when the prophecy comes, when Trelawney's words echo in his memory, he looks at Harry not as a chess piece, but as a boy whose future must remain his own. The stone's whispers have taught him that orchestrating everything does not resurrect the dead, it only repeats the sin. So he tells Harry more, earlier. He respects free will because he has seen, night after night, what the theft of it cost his sister. But there is a darker possibility. What if the stone doesn't heal him at all, but deepens the addiction to the past he already carries? Imagine Dumbledore, who spends his most intimate hours not with Minerva or Hagrid or the Order, but with spectral versions of Ariana and Grindelwald, rehearsing choices he can never unmake. The living world becomes the intermission. The dead are the main act. The Order of the Phoenix meets downstairs, while, upstairs, he is arguing strategy with the memory of the boy he once loved and the sister he failed to save. In that version, his obsession with prophecy and atonement twists tighter. If Ariana's sad eyes seem to plead for Voldemort's fall at any cost, if Grindelwald's ghost mocks his hesitation, Dumbledore may double down on the belief that he alone must orchestrate every move. Harry's autonomy becomes something he talks about, but does not truly grant, because in his mind, he is not controlling a child. He is finally doing something worth fighting for in Ariana's name. Most importantly, in both trajectories, the stone becomes a rival love. It offers a connection that never argues back in truly unpredictable ways, never shocks him like a living person might. His confidences go upward, into the ring, instead of outward, toward colleagues. So when the time comes to speak to Harry about horcruxes and hallows, about death and choice and sacrifice, we have to ask, can a man who has learned to trust the dead with everything still bring himself to trust the living with the whole terrible truth? That fracture between the office lit by candlelight and the boy waiting below will define what he says and what he withholds. Year 1. Reframed, a headmaster already dying. So when we step into that first September feast, we have to look again. The great hall blazing with candles, the sorting hat finishing its song, and Dumbledore rising to speak. In canon, it's sherbet lemons and nitwit, blubber, oddment, tweak. But what if, beneath the twinkle and nonsense, his hand is already blackened under a conjured glove, his nerves still echoing with the touch of the Gaunt ring? What if the man who tells children to tuck in and sleep well has just come from whispering with the dead? This isn't a story about making him suddenly cold or cruel. This is a story about a headmaster who knows, from the very first feast Harry ever attends, that his years are numbered, not in vague abstractions, but in Snape-measured months. So the whimsy stays, but it's edged with urgency. The welcome speech lingers half a beat too long, on the importance of choice, on the protection of home, on the love that once left a lightning scar on a baby's forehead. He is talking to all of them. He is actually talking to one. When Harry finds the Mirror of Irist, the canon scene is already haunting. Here, it becomes almost unbearable, because Dumbledore doesn't just theorize about the dangers of living in dreams. He has just lived them, kneeling in the Gaunt shack, clutching the resurrection stone, seeing Ariana, his parents, maybe even a younger, uncorrupted Grindelwald. So when he tells Harry, it does not do to dwell on dreams and forget to live, his voice might catch, almost imperceptibly. He is not only warning Harry, he is confessing. We're exploring a Dumbledore who sits beside the mirror a little longer, who watches Harry's reflection with something more profound than academic interest. Does he press a bit harder? Ask Harry what he sees, not to satisfy curiosity, but to measure how tightly this boy will cling to what he's lost. And when he walks away, does he move like someone who has just left his own heart on the glass? Most importantly, does the looming curse change how he designs the protections around the Philosopher's Stone? In canon, the Gauntlet of Tasks feels like an elaborate test dressed up as security. Here, that subtext becomes text. If he no longer believes he has 6 safe school years to prepare Harry, does he lean into the danger? Does he make sure that a flying key chase, a life-size chess match, and a final confrontation with Voldemort's shade are not accidents, but a carefully calibrated crucible, the first real move in a game he knows he won't live to finish, and around him, the staff watch. McGonagall notices the glove he never removes, the weariness in his posture after late-night absences, the way his gaze rests on Harry a fraction too long. She doesn't know about the curse, not yet, but she knows Albus, so a quiet, protective alliance forms. Extra eyes on Quirrell, extra care with Harry's detentions, extra questions in private. If he is planning something, she will make sure the boy survives it, because if Dumbledore walks into year 1 already dying, the stone is not an isolated adventure. It is the opening movement in a series of trials, each sharper, each closer to the bone, and the real question is not whether Harry will face them, it's how far Dumbledore is willing to go before the curse claims his hand and his conscience. Pattern. Interrupt. What if the diary wasn't the first Horcrux clue? But let's interrupt that slow, chess-like progression and jump forward. The basilisk is dead, the chamber is closed, and a small black diary lies on Dumbledore's desk, pierced by a basilisk fang and Harry's innocence. In canon, this is a quiet, almost throwaway moment. Dumbledore turns the diary over in his hands, asks a few probing questions, and files it away as deeply suspicious. He suspects Horcrux-like magic, yes, but it will take years. Slughorn's altered memory, more disappearances, more deaths, before he finally names Voldemort's strategy for what it actually is. But what if the man holding that diary is already dying? What if, in this timeline, the curse from the Gaunt ring is already burning through his hand beneath those silver bandages, a constant reminder that he is out of time? This isn't a story about a patient general waiting for the right move. This is a story about a commander who knows the board is collapsing and every clue might be his last. So when Harry, still 12, explains what happened in the chamber, how the diary spoke, possessed Ginny, preserved a 16-year-old Tom Riddle, Dumbledore doesn't just look intrigued, he looks electrified, terrified. He recognizes the signature at once, a fragment of soul, anchored, preserved, and then destroyed by basilisk venom, not a puzzle piece, a smoking gun. We're exploring a Dumbledore who has already handled one Horcrux with his cursed hand, already felt that oily wrongness in the ring, already decided that Voldemort has done something more profound and more monstrous than anyone else has dared. So he does not let the diary vanish quietly into his office. He traces its path. Lucius Malfoy is not merely confronted in a corridor and accidentally disarmed of Dobby. He is called, formally, to the headmaster's office. The door closes. The portraits lean in. And Dumbledore, whose time is bleeding away, asks very specific questions. Where did you get this? Who else has objects like this? What did the Dark Lord entrust to you? The politeness remains, but the temperature drops. The stakes are clear. In parallel, Dumbledore goes backward as well as forward. He reopens memories of Tom Riddle long before Half-Blood Prince. He combs the pensive for every flicker of obsession in that boy's eyes. Trophies, founders, the Gaunt shack, the orphanage. While Harry is still recovering in the hospital wing, Dumbledore is already sketching a map of potential Horcrux locations. Each circle on the parchment a promise and a countdown. Harry doesn't know the word Horcrux yet. He doesn't need to, but he feels the difference. The twinkle in Dumbledore's eyes is dimmer, the whimsical asides rarer. When they talk about love and loyalty saving Ginny, there is a new intensity, as if Dumbledore is testing the edges of Harry's heart, measuring how much this boy can bear. And most importantly, this pattern interrupt widens the whole frame. We're not just changing a death date, we're accelerating an investigation that was always meant to collide with Harry's adolescence. What happens when the Horcrux hunt doesn't wait for 16-year-old Harry, but begins stalking 12-year-old Harry instead? We'll examine that collision next, where childhood, prophecy, and a dying headmaster finally crash into each other. Year 2, a headmaster who knows time is running out. So when we drop into year 2 in this alternate timeline, we're not just revisiting a haunted bathroom and a basilisk in the pipes. We're walking into a school year where the headmaster already knows his clock is ticking, where every attack on a Muggleborn isn't just a crisis, it's a countdown. What if the Chamber of Secrets opens in a world where Dumbledore has already faced the Gaunt shack, already slipped the ring onto his finger for one catastrophic moment, already felt death coil around his veins? The attacks begin, the walls bleed messages, and outwardly he is the same, calm, twinkling, maddeningly oblique. But inside, we're exploring a man who has seen Ariana's face in the stone and heard his own timepiece crack. That knowledge sharpens everything. It makes every choice hurt. Canon gives us a Dumbledore who leaves Hogwarts under suspension with almost serene resignation, trusting that help will always be given at Hogwarts. Here, that line is not enough. When Lucius Malfoy arrives with the board's decree, Dumbledore still goes quietly, but he engineers his absence as one last lesson. A dropped remark to McGonagall about old-school records best not left to molder, a casual instruction that Hagrid's case file and Riddle's award remain in his office rather than the archive, a lingering glance at the empty space where Tom once stood as a prefect. He is laying breadcrumbs, not just faith. Before that removal, we get an office scene that tilts the whole year. Harry is brought up after another attack, Fawkes watching, the ring's blackened curse hidden in a deeper sleeve. Dumbledore studies this 12-year-old boy, who is already a Horcrux's neighbor, without knowing it, and the diary sits between them like a quiet bomb. He almost says it, that Voldemort feared death above all, that objects can be made to hold pieces of a soul, that this diary is not merely enchanted, but possessed by something more profound and more obscene. His voice even starts, "There are magics, Harry, which bind a life to the world in unnatural ways." And then he stops, because this isn't a story about turning a child into a soldier at 12. It's a story about a dying man trying disastrously to keep Harry a child for one more year while still steering him towards survival. He redirects, asks Harry instead about loyalty, about love, about why the Sorting Hat ever considered Slytherin. He chooses parable over confession, and the moment passes, but not cleanly, not this time. So when Ginny Weasley disappears and the school teeters on closure, his desperation is different. In canon, he trusts in Harry's resourcefulness and Fawkes's timing. Here, he also suspects, with horrible clarity, that the diary is exactly what he's been studying, a vessel for a soul fragment, a rehearsal horcrux left in a school full of children. He knows now what a torn soul feels like. He has touched its echo through the ring and through the stone. The idea of Harry facing that alone is unbearable. From suspension, he works every angle he still has, a phoenix that lingers closer to Harry than usual. Portraits nudge to mention Riddle's name, to talk about the last time the chamber opened. Even Hagrid, in his clumsy way, is primed to push Harry toward the castle's forgotten histories, rather than just the spiders. And when it's over, when the basilisk is dead, the diary is pierced, and Fawkes brings Harry back, this Dumbledore returns to an office that feels, for the first time, like a mausoleum. The portraits are dozing, the instruments are still. On his desk lie two objects that define his secret war, the cracked resurrection stone hidden in the ring, and the ruined diary, ink bleeding like old blood. He takes them both in his hands, and for a moment, the greatest wizard of the age is just an old brother whispering into the quiet, "I am so sorry, Ariana, I risked another child." Most importantly, he knows this was only the prologue. If a simple diary nearly killed Harry, what will the Triwizard tournament do? What happens when Voldemort's full return rips away the last illusion of childhood and forces a cursed headmaster to finally choose between telling Harry everything and keeping him safe for even one more year? That's the collision waiting in year 4, when the game and the cost both become extraordinary. Micro scene, Dumbledore and the stone after the chamber. So let's pause the roar of the Quidditch pitch and the glitter of the Triwizard Cup, and slip back to a quieter night. The feast is over, the chamber is closed, and in a tower office above all that celebrating, Albus Dumbledore sits alone with two dead things, a shredded diary and a blackened ring. This isn't a story about the basilisk anymore. It's about what happens when the man who always seems to know everything is left with the evidence of how close he came to losing Harry. Again, the diary lies open on his desk, its pages punctured, ink bled out like something wounded. Beside it, the Gaunt ring catches the candlelight in a way that feels wrong, like the shadows are leaning in. We're exploring the moment after the toasts and the laughter, when the headmaster who congratulated a 12-year-old boy for his extraordinary bravery walks back to his office and can't quite breathe. Because what if the chamber had ended differently? What if Ginny Weasley had stayed cold on the stone floor? What if Harry had died in the tunnels beneath his school while Dumbledore smiled for the end-of-year photograph? His hand shakes as he turns the ring. He has already recognized the Hallows symbol. He has already suspected, perhaps even confirmed, that it is a horcrux. He knows, intellectually, what he should do. Destroy it, lock it away, call for Snape. But love is not intellectual, and guilt is not rational, and the stone offers something he has always wanted back. He slips it on. The office doesn't explode. No green flash, no thunder, just a soft pressure in the air, like the moment before a storm, and then she is there. Ariana, small and pale, and almost the right age, standing by Fawkes's empty perch, eyes wide and dark, and not quite meeting his. Ariana, he whispers, and his voice cracks on the second syllable. He reaches out, of course he does, fingers trembling toward her hair, her cheek, the hem of her dress. His hand passes through. The contact that isn't there hurts more than any curse. He talks, because what else can he do? He confesses that he nearly let another child die under his watch, that a diary, a simple little book, almost repeated Godric's Hollow, and that awful summer all over again. He asks her if he is becoming that boy again, the one who followed Grindelwald, who dreamed of power and the greater good, while his sister slipped further out of reach. This is a story about a different kind of love, not the bright new connection of two teenagers, but the heavy old bond of blood and regret. He tells her that part of him wants to stay here, in this illusion, to sit with her forever, and let the war outside burn itself out without him. He apologizes for not choosing that, for choosing the living, for choosing Harry. He waits for her answer. Ariana says nothing. Her expression flickers. Sorrow? Forgiveness? Accusation? Or is that just the way the candle wavers through her? He decides, because he has to, that she forgives him, that she understands. But we're left to ask, does she, actually, or is he building absolution out of smoke? Most importantly, the stone comforts him and unmoors him at the same time. It gives him the courage to double down on Harry as something worth fighting for, and it makes every choice after this less purely strategic, more desperate, more personal. When he takes the ring off, the office is empty again, but the line between duty and longing has blurred. And if this is how he breaks after a diary, what will he do when a graveyard, a reborn Dark Lord, and a boy screaming over Cedric Diggory force him to put the ring back on? Year 3, without a safety net, Sirius, Dementors, and a dying mentor. The graveyard fades, but the ring never really leaves him. By the time Sirius escapes Azkaban and the wizarding world starts whispering again, Dumbledore is already living with a deadline carved into his bones, and that changes how he looks at everything, at Dementors, at fugitives, at a boy who keeps almost dying on school grounds. In canon, Year 3 opens with fear on the front page and Dementors on the train, while Dumbledore plays his familiar role. Protective, yes, but maddeningly opaque. He argues against Dementors at Hogwarts, but accepts them at the gates. He believes Sirius is innocent, but waits until the very end to help. He cares about Harry, but keeps him at arm's length, trusting that there will be time later to explain. In this timeline, what if that quiet confidence is gone? What if every choice is sharpened by the knowledge that there may not be a later at all? We're exploring a Dumbledore who is not just philosophically opposed to Dementors, but personally terrified of what they will do to Harry's already fragile psyche when he himself might not be around to heal the damage. The boy who hears his mother's death every time a Dementor draws near is the same boy Dumbledore has seen reflected in the Resurrection Stone's promise of what if. So he pushes back harder. Maybe he refuses to allow Dementors on the train at all. Maybe he limits their patrols, erects stronger charms around the pitch, the dormitories, the hospital wing, not because he suddenly loves rules, but because he finally admits to himself, I may not be here to pick up the pieces. Most importantly, he stops pretending he can be Harry's only anchor. This isn't a story about Dumbledore hoarding mentorship. This is a story about him deliberately building a network Harry can lean on when he's gone. So Lupin doesn't just drift into Harry's life through boggart lessons and chocolate on the train. Dumbledore nudges. He arranges extra sessions on defensive magic earlier in the term, frames them explicitly as training, not just remediation. He encourages Lupin to talk about James, about Lily, about love and friendship and the Marauder's best moments, giving Harry a living connection to his parents that the Resurrection Stone can only imitate. And Sirius? Here the curse bites deepest. In canon, Dumbledore moves subtly, a few quiet words in the hospital wing, a last-minute plan with the Time Turner, a promise to do what he can. In this version, does he finally decide that secrecy has cost enough? We'll examine a man weighing two impossible priorities: protect the prophecy and Horcrux plan, or fight openly to clear Sirius so Harry has family in place before the curse wins. Maybe he still cannot risk a full public battle. Voldemort's immortality is something more profound than any single injustice, but behind the scenes, he presses Fudge harder, leans on old allies, leaves paper trails and memories that can be used later, because Harry must not be left alone with only a Dursley-shaped childhood and a headmaster-shaped ghost. By the time the Time Turner comes into play, the difference is subtle but extraordinary. Dumbledore's canonical orchestration of that night is already meticulous. Here, it becomes almost surgical. He doesn't just send Harry and Hermione back to save Buckbeak and Sirius. He is consciously staging a lesson in how to bend time, outwit the Ministry, and save lives without him. Every whispered instruction, every pointed glance at the clock, is a rehearsal for a future where they will have to make impossible choices together without a safety net. And as the clock in the hospital wing ticks toward midnight, he knows this may be one of his last chances to teach them how to save themselves. Case study: the hospital wing night reimagined. So when we slip back into that hospital wing, we're not just revisiting a familiar canon moment, we're exploring what happens when the man at the foot of Harry's bed is already dying, already haunted, already holding death and the dead in the palm of his hand. The scene opens the same way. White sheets, moonlight spilling in thin, cold lines. Harry and Hermione frantic, tripping over each other's words about Sirius, about Dementors, about a fate worse than death, waiting in a stone fortress. Madame Pomfrey fusses. The clock ticks toward midnight, and then the door opens. Dumbledore enters with that same soft rustle of robes, that same gentle twinkle. But this time, if we look closer, the light behind it is strained, stretched over something raw. There are deeper shadows under his eyes, a tightness in his shoulders that wasn't there before the Gaunt ring, before the curse that even now is coiled in his blackened hand, held at bay by Snape's skill and sheer will. He listens to Harry, to Hermione, lets their panic wash over him like a familiar tide. Then he says, almost word for word, that there might be a way to save more than one innocent life tonight. He still speaks in hints, still dances around the Time Turner, but his gaze lingers on Harry longer than canon allows, as if memorizing the angle of his jaw, the way his hands knot in the sheets, the fierce, unpolished love that flares whenever Sirius's name is spoken. What if, just for a heartbeat, he almost tells the truth, that saving Sirius is not only mercy, not only justice, but strategy, that Harry will need this man, this link to James, when the war tightens and Dumbledore himself is gone. His mouth even starts to form the words, and then he swallows them, because this isn't a story about unburdening himself. This is a story about preparing Harry to stand alone. 3 turns should do it, he says instead, gesturing toward the window, toward the sinking sun. They will soon rewind. His gloved hand trembles, just once. Harry notices. Of course he does. Sir, your hand... Ah, Dumbledore interrupts lightly, that thin, wry humor slipping into place like armor. Old age, Harry. It comes to us all. With any luck, much later for you. The joke lands, but only just, and Hermione's eyes narrow, sensing something more profound and far more dangerous. When they leave, when the door clicks shut and time itself begins to bend, Dumbledore is finally alone. The hospital wing is quiet now, but his mind is roaring. He reaches into his robes and closes his fingers around the stone. Not the ring as Horcrux, he has already destroyed that, but the Hallow he could not resist, the one that called to every regret he has ever had. Ariana appears in the dim light, fragile and flickering, not whole, never whole. I'm trying, he whispers, voice breaking in a way no student will ever hear. This time I will save the innocent man. I will not sacrifice him to the greater good. I will not sacrifice another child to my plans. Isn't that the quiet pivot of this entire what if? Every act of guidance toward Harry from this night on becomes double-edged. Strategy and penance, leadership and apology, calculation and a desperate, almost parental love. When he sends Harry and Hermione spinning back through time, he isn't only teaching them how to reshape events, he is begging the universe for one last chance to do better, to let love and mercy stand beside cunning. Most importantly, this moment reframes everything that follows. When Dumbledore looks at Harry now, he doesn't just see a weapon or a prophecy, he sees a boy he will not outlive, a boy he must equip and cherish, and in the end, trust completely. That is something worth fighting for. And it means that the next time he stands in the shadows, watching Harry cast a Patronus, or face a dragon, or walk into a forest, the choice to stay back will hurt in a new, sharper way, because now, every lesson is a farewell in disguise. Hook forward, a Triwizard tournament with a different puppet master. Every lesson is a farewell in disguise, and then the goblet of fire flares blue. So where are we, as that strange, enchanted flame begins to burn? We're in a Hogwarts where Dumbledore has already slipped the Gaunt ring onto his finger years too early, where the Resurrection Stone's whisper has become a constant presence, where his hand is cursed and his life is quietly on a clock. He is bound to Snape by an unbreakable promise made in desperation, already accelerating his Horcrux theory, already hunting for fragments of Tom Riddle's soul while pretending that everything is normal, and through all of it, he is trying to protect Harry without smothering the boy's capacity to choose. Canon gives us a headmaster in Goblet of Fire who still believes he has time, who can afford to play a longer game, to test, to observe, to let events unfold. But what if, in this timeline, he walks into that same year knowing he may not see Harry turn 16. What if the man who hears Moody growl, constant vigilance, is already living it every waking moment? When the goblet spits out Harry's name, the Great Hall erupts in outrage, suspicion, fear. In canon, Dumbledore insists on the binding nature of magical contracts and allows the Ministry to push Harry into the tournament. Here, he is dying. Here, he has held the stone and seen his sister's eyes. Does he really let Barty Crouch Sr. and Ludo Bagman dictate terms? Or does he draw a quieter, harder line, demanding to see the goblet, the age line, the wand movements, the memories of everyone near that cup? We're exploring a Dumbledore who has less patience for bureaucratic blindness and more urgency about invisible threats. So, when Mad-Eye Moody arrives, limping and scarred, does Dumbledore accept him with that same wry trust? Or does a man racing death start asking sharper questions? We'll examine what changes when he orders Snape to brew more than wolfsbane in the dungeons, when he quietly pulls at the tangle of Barty Crouch Jr., Imperious Curses, and Polyjuice months earlier, because he simply cannot afford surprises. Most importantly, how does he treat Harry through all of this? In canon, he withholds the full prophecy, the Hallows, the depth of his own fear. In this story, every task, every dragon, every trip to the Pensieve is doubled, a lesson for today and a legacy for tomorrow. Does he finally sit Harry down after the first task, when the boy has already faced death and fire, and share at least a shard of the prophecy? Does he admit that Voldemort marked him, that love once saved him, that love may have to save him again when Dumbledore is gone? Because this isn't a story about changing who wins the tournament. This is a story about changing who Harry is when he touches that Triwizard cup. The closer Voldemort comes to returning, the more Dumbledore is forced into an impossible choice. Keep Harry in the dark a little longer, or equip him for a world where the headmaster he trusts will not be there to explain the rules. And in this timeline, when Voldemort rises in that graveyard, Dumbledore isn't just facing the return of his greatest enemy, he's facing the terrifying possibility that he won't live long enough to finish the fight. Year 4. Fire, dragons, and a cracking chessboard. So when Harry's name bursts from the Goblet of Fire in this timeline, the moment doesn't feel like a shocking twist to Dumbledore. It feels like confirmation, the move he's been waiting for. In canon, we remember the performance, the confusion, the raised voice, the almost theatrical demand of, "Did you put your name in the Goblet of Fire?" Here, the curse burning quietly in his hand strips away performance. His reaction is sharper, cleaner, almost terrifying in its focus. He doesn't see a prank, or even a political problem. He sees Voldemort's hand on the board at last. What if, instead of trying to calm the hall, he's already tracing the line from a bewitched goblet to a graveyard? Instead of wondering who wants Harry embarrassed, he's asking who wants Harry delivered. The difference is subtle on the surface, but emotionally seismic, because this isn't a story about a headmaster juggling school drama. This is a story about a dying general recognizing the opening move of the final war. That clarity bleeds straight into his dealings with the Ministry. Canon Dumbledore plays the long game with Cornelius Fudge. Gentle corrections, patient explanations, a careful avoidance of open rupture. Cursed Dumbledore doesn't have that luxury. We're exploring a man whose clock is ticking louder every day. So when Fudge arrives, blustering about rules and contracts, Dumbledore is less conciliatory, more confrontational. He doesn't argue that Harry must compete because those are the rules. He argues that Harry must be protected because Voldemort is moving. And when Fudge flinches from that name, Dumbledore actually presses, not retreats. There's no time left for gradual persuasion. That urgency reshapes Harry's preparation. In canon, Dumbledore remains distant, almost coldly observant, trusting that help will appear around Harry without overt orchestration. Here, he quietly builds a net. McGonagall is nudged not just to worry, but to intervene. A transfiguration primer that happens to include advanced dragon theory. Lupin is invited back under some pretext, his letters full of dueling tips and Patronus refinements. Even Snape, bound by that unbreakable vow, and by a promise that is now on a shorter fuse, is pressed to act. Subtle brews for focus, barbed remedial lessons that are actually survival training. We'll examine how every adult around Harry becomes, not a spectator, but a shield. Does Dumbledore hint more openly to Harry? He has to. The tournament stops being just a school event and becomes a rehearsal for the graveyard, for the Horcrux hunt, for a life where Harry stands without him. So their rare conversations are edged with something more profound. You will face what others have not, he might say, and Harry hears a warning. Dumbledore hears a countdown. Most importantly, each task becomes a metaphor. The dragon is raw fear, the lake is love, and what you'll always risk to save it. The maze is the war, confusing, treacherous, full of false lights. And beneath it all, the chessboard between Dumbledore and Voldemort is beginning to crack, each move echoing with the knowledge that the White King is already dying. Because what if the real Triwizard magic here isn't spectacle at all, but a desperate attempt to pass on courage, skill, and love before the endgame finally arrives? Graveyard. Aftermath. A different conversation in the hospital wing. The maze becomes the war, and the graveyard becomes the proof. When Harry wakes in the hospital wing, the cheers from the stands have already curdled into whispers, and Dumbledore is no longer just the White King on a cracking chessboard. He is a man whose hand is blackened beneath his sleeve, whose time has been cut even shorter by a ring he should never have worn. Canon gives us a Dumbledore who is grave, focused, but still almost untouchable in that first debrief. Here, the difference is immediate. Harry, shaking, keeps seeing Cedric fall. Dumbledore, watching, keeps seeing Ariana. The stone has been calling to him ever since the graveyard reports reached the castle, promising one more conversation, one more chance to ask forgiveness. But Voldemort's resurrection slams the door on that fantasy. There is no retreat into the dead tonight. There is only this boy, this pain, this moment. So what if Dumbledore chooses more honesty, not because he suddenly becomes reckless, but because he finally understands how little time he actually has? He dismisses Fudge more quickly, lets McGonagall and Madame Pomfrey fuss Harry into a quieter corner, and then sits down, slowly, like every joint hurts. Harry, he says, and in this version the name comes out thinner, older. He does not tell the whole prophecy, not yet, but he does not pretend Voldemort is merely back. He explains, in careful spare words, that Tom Riddle has been preparing for this return for decades, that he has made himself very hard to kill, that this isn't a story about simple victories and neat endings. We're exploring a Dumbledore who hints at Horcruxes years before canon, without naming them outright. He speaks of magic that anchors the soul to the world, of protections that require acts of great evil and great mutilation. He tells Harry that when his mother died for him, she created something more profound than any such dark spell. Love as shield, love as weapon, love as the one thing Voldemort never understood. Most importantly, he admits his own failure. He tells Harry, in broad strokes, that he has been hunting traces of Voldemort's past, and that he has already destroyed one such anchor, but at a terrible cost. His hand, glimpsed when he reaches for a glass of water, is no longer easily hidden. Harry stares. Harry asks if he is dying. Dumbledore does not lie. He deflects gently, but he does not promise he will always be there, and that changes the bond between them. Harry's trust deepens because he can finally feel the cracks in the marble statue. He is being treated as a partner, not a child. But that same honesty plants a new, cold fear. If Dumbledore falls, who will stand between him and the thing in the graveyard? When Harry finally sleeps, exhausted, Dumbledore remains. The stone presses against his mind, whispering of Kendra, of Ariana, of his brother's bitter eyes, and Grindelwald's laughter. Instead, he pulls parchment toward him and begins to write. Diary, ring, cup, locket, snake, something of Ravenclaw, something of Gryffindor. We'll examine how precise his guesses are later. For now, what matters is the chill that runs through him as he counts. 6, 7, too many. His hand trembles. He realizes, with a clarity that feels like a curse all its own, that he may not live to destroy them all, which means someone else will have to. And as his quill hovers over Harry's name, he has to decide whether the boy in the next bed is a student to protect, or the only knight left who can cross the board before the king finally falls. Pattern interrupt. What if the order was built around Harry, not Dumbledore? He chooses both. On that quiet night in the infirmary, Dumbledore stops thinking of the order as his army and starts imagining it as Harry's inheritance. And that single shift sends cracks through the entire war we think we know. In canon, the Order of the Phoenix orbits one blazing center. Dumbledore is the strategist, the secret keeper, the one with the map in his head and the plan in his pocket. Everyone else, McGonagall, Lupin, Kingsley, even Mad Eye, fights bravely, but they move around his gravity. When he falls from the astronomy tower, the war staggers because the sun has gone out. But what if the curse on his hand arrives years earlier, and Dumbledore knows, with ruthless certainty, that the sun is already setting? This isn't a story about one general directing pieces from a distance. This is a story about a man forced to build a world that will outlive him, even if that world has to learn to breathe without him. So he starts talking. We're exploring an order that is designed from day one to function without its founder. McGonagall is no longer simply the stern deputy who keeps Hogwarts running, while Dumbledore vanishes on mysterious errands. She sits in on strategy sessions, sees the Horcrux notes, hears the word Hallows before it becomes legend again. Lupin isn't just a kind face on Grimmauld Place's staircase. He is briefed on Riddle's past, on the Gaunt shack, on what the ring has already cost. Kingsley is pulled closer, not just as an Auror contact, but as a future coordinator of a resistance that will have to work both inside and outside the Ministry. Most importantly, Dumbledore stops hoarding contingencies. He draws maps and then hands them away. And when Harry steps into Grimmauld Place, the air feels different. In canon, that house is a fortress of whispered conversations that end when he walks in, a place where he is always the protected child hearing doors close. Here, the pattern interrupts. Meetings do not stop when Harry appears. They shift. McGonagall asks what he sensed in his scar dreams. Lupin quietly pushes a parchment toward him and says, "Look at this pattern of attacks." Kingsley doesn't just guard the door. He asks Harry what he would do if the door fell. Harry is still excluded from the darkest details, still a teenager, still aching. But he can feel the truth under the secrecy. They are not only shielding him, they are, slowly, relentlessly, shaping him, preparing a future leader who will have to hold them all together when the old headmaster finally doesn't walk through that door. And in the shadows of this new order stands Snape, with an earlier unbreakable vow and more information about Horcruxes and the Hallows. He is no longer only a solitary double agent improvising in the dark. Dumbledore folds him into the posthumous design, which memories Harry must see, which lies Voldemort must believe, which protections must be anchored in Hogwarts itself. Snape becomes a grim pillar of the plan rather than a wandering blade, his cruelty at school reframed as part of a role he has agreed to play until the very end. So the war itself tilts. It is no longer Dumbledore versus Voldemort with Harry as a single fragile piece on the board. It is a network, a web of adults and students, of Aurors and teachers and outcasts, all quietly oriented around one beating center that hasn't yet realized it is the heart. What if the real legacy of the Gaunt Ring's curse isn't just Dumbledore's death, but the way he chooses to teach everyone else how to live without him? And when that heart finally understands what he's been prepared for, what does he do with that terrible, extraordinary love and responsibility? Year 5, angrier, Harry, sicker Dumbledore. So when we open Year 5, in this altered timeline, that terrible, extraordinary love and responsibility is already under siege. The boy who has been shaped as the heart of this war returns to Hogwarts desperate for answers, and the one man who promised them is literally fading before his eyes. In canon, Dumbledore's distance in Order of the Phoenix is framed as strategy. Keep Voldemort out of Harry's mind. Keep Harry out of Dumbledore's. Here, what if that avoidance carries something more visible, more frightening? The blackened hand he keeps hidden in canon is now worse. Veins like ink, a tremor he cannot fully suppress, a weariness that drags at his posture. Every time Harry glimpses him across the Great Hall and Dumbledore looks away, it is not only secrecy, it is shame. It is the stone's toll, the echo of Ariana and Grindelwald whispering that he has failed again. This isn't a story about a wise old mentor playing chess with perfect detachment. This is a story about a man who has already looked into the faces of his dead and is trying badly to look away from the living. We're exploring what happens when that choice collides with a 15-year-old who has been promised honesty after a graveyard of lies. Harry's anger in Year 5 is already volcanic. Now imagine that anger sharpened by the sense that Dumbledore is not just distant, but hiding something personal. At Grimmauld Place, when the adults close ranks, when Sirius and Molly argue about what Harry should know, the question that gnaws at him is different. Not only why won't they tell me, but why won't he look at me like I matter when he might be dying? Every cancelled meeting, every message sent through McGonagall or a Phoenix feels like abandonment from the one adult who said, in the hospital wing after the graveyard, that they would face the truth together. So does Dumbledore crack sooner? The snake attack on Arthur Weasley becomes the breaking point. In canon, he escalates the occlumency plan. Here, he does that and something more. Picture the hospital corridor at St. Mungo's. Late at night, Dumbledore's silhouette thinner, his cursed hand exposed for one unguarded moment. Harry sees, of course he sees, and Dumbledore, exhausted by pain and the stone's quiet siren call, finally confesses part of the truth. The prophecy, the cursed ring, the fact that his time is limited. But even this confession is curated. He does not name Hallows. He does not admit that love for his family and Grindelwald made him weak, and that half-truth cuts. Harry walks away carrying two unbearable weights at once, that he is the chosen one, and that the only person who seems to know how this war works is dying and still shaping the narrative from above. Most importantly, this knowledge doesn't create trust, it corrodes it. When the visions of Sirius in the Department of Mysteries begin, this Harry hesitates for different reasons. He knows more. He trusts less. Does he tell Dumbledore earlier? Does he suspect manipulation? Or fear that Dumbledore will trade Sirius for strategy? Whatever he chooses, the battle that follows is no longer just about a glass sphere. It is about a boy testing whether any adult will ever truly treat him as a partner, and about an old man whose guilt over that answer will define his final year. And if the heart of the story walks into the Hall of Prophecy, already half convinced that he is alone, what breaks there? And what, if anything, is left to heal in Year 6? The Department of Mysteries, a battle without a net. So, when the prophecy shatters and the shelves explode, we're not just replaying a canon action scene with better choreography. We're exploring what happens when the one adult Harry still half trusts is already dying, already compromised, already fighting with a hand that can barely close around his wand. In this timeline, Dumbledore's arrival is not a blaze of effortless control. He is late, not disastrously, but fatally close. The cursed hand slows his apparition, his casting, even the way he draws himself up between Harry and Voldemort. Spells that were once fluid now cost him. We can imagine the same water serpent, the same ring of fire, but each conjuration leaves him a fraction more winded, his shoulders a fraction more bowed, and Voldemort, who always reads weakness like a language, presses harder, faster, crueler. What if the duel in the atrium stops being a masterclass and becomes a knife edge? When chaos meets precision, when raw hatred meets exhausted brilliance, when two former prodigies, who once chased immortality in different ways, finally clash without a net. This isn't a story about spectacle. This is a story about an old man trying to buy seconds with a body that is already spent. Under that pressure, does he reach for the stone? The ring is destroyed as a horcrux, but the resurrection stone's lure remains, whispering Ariana, whispering Grindelwald, whispering all the conversations he never completed. We'll examine the most dangerous temptation, not to raise the dead, but to ask them what to do. In a flash of green and gold light, could he, for a heartbeat, see Ariana at the edge of his vision and falter? Or does he, actually, use that imagined presence as a focus, a brutal reminder of what Voldemort's path costs, and tighten his aim? Here, the smallest hesitation matters. Sirius is dueling Bellatrix on that thin stone archway, while Harry watches, heart in his throat. In canon, Dumbledore's control over the battlefield is near total the moment he arrives. Here, his slower entrance, his cursed hand, his divided attention mean the duel rages a breath longer, a step further toward the veil. Maybe he is a second too late to disarm Bellatrix. Maybe he tries to reposition the entire fight and his magic flares unevenly. The result is the same fall, the same impossible curtain, but now Dumbledore knows, instantly, that his own weakness helped tip the balance. After the Ministry, the office conversation can't be delayed behind twinkling eyes and half-truths. Harry is raw, Hermione is pale and furious, and Dumbledore is visibly failing. Does he finally lay everything bare? Horcruxes, Hallows, the curse eating his arm, the fact that he has always planned to die. Or does he still ration the truth, convinced that love means shielding Harry from the full horror of the mission for just a little longer? Most importantly, after nearly losing Harry and actually losing Sirius, what if the man who is already marked for death has to decide? Double down on controlling the endgame from the shadows, or finally trust his heart and Harry with everything? And if he chooses wrong in this moment, what exactly is left to save in year 6? Between wars, Dumbledore's darkest night with the stone. So what does he do with that question echoing in his mind? He goes back to where it all began. Not to the astronomy tower, not to his office, with its warm lamps and lemon drops, but to the ruined Gaunt shack, the place where love and death and ambition first fused into the curse burning through his hand. The night is wind and ash and memory. The ring, cracked and powerless as a horcrux, still waits on the broken table. The stone within it still whispers of what if. He should not be here. He knows that. Every instinct as headmaster, as commander of the order, as the man who is supposed to keep Harry alive, says, stay away. But this isn't a story about instincts winning. This is a story about temptation returning when he is weakest. After the veil, after Sirius falls, after Harry's scream in the Department of Mysteries has carved a new scar into Albus Dumbledore's already ruined heart. He takes the stone in his good hand, turns it once, twice, 3 times. The air tightens, and then they are there. Ariana comes first, as she always does in his nightmares. Small, uncertain, caught forever in that impossible space between child and victim. Behind her, Lily and James, standing together like a photograph that has finally stepped off the page. Lily's eyes fierce and kind, James watchful, jaw clenched. And then Sirius, lounging even in death, arms folded, gaze sharp in a way it rarely was in life. A spectral council of the dead, drawn into this ruined room by one old man's refusal to let go. They do not speak. That is the worst part. Their silence is a mirror he cannot look away from, because we're exploring something more profound here than simple grief. We're examining the pattern. Ariana, then the Potters, then Sirius. How many times has he allowed others to stand between him and the blow? How often has he told himself it was for the greater good? That familiar, poisonous phrase that still tastes of Grindelwald's laughter and young bright afternoons in Godric's Hollow? And of course, because the stone is cruel, Grindelwald's shade comes too. Not as he ended, broken in Normangard, but as he was when Albus loved him. Brilliant, beautiful, eyes alight with that terrifying certainty. You see, the silence seems to say, you were always willing to pay with other people's lives. You just finally admitted it to yourself. Was using the stone itself an act of selfish love? In this moment, he cannot pretend otherwise. He has chosen his need for closure over his duty, risked the Hallows secret, risked his clarity, for one more chance to stand in the same room with those he failed. What if the headmaster of Hogwarts is actually just a boy again, clutching at ghosts, instead of protecting the living? He looks at Ariana and sees Harry. He looks at Lily and James and sees the prophecy. He looks at Sirius and feels the weight of every withheld truth, and something in him finally breaks in the right direction. Either he will tell Harry everything about horcruxes, about Hallows, about the plan that ends with his own death, or he will refine that plan into the sharpest possible weapon, using his death as the final move in a game Harry never agreed to play. Both paths are before him in this shack. Both are terrible. Which one is actually love? Which one is control dressed up as sacrifice? When he leaves, the stone is cold in his palm, and his decision, whatever it is, has hardened. The next time he looks at Harry across his desk, we will feel it. The chill of a man who has chosen how he wants to die, and what, or who, he is willing to spend in order to win. And as year 6 approaches, we have to ask, if Dumbledore walks into it with that kind of resolve, what exactly is left for Harry to decide at all? Pattern. Interrupt. What if Dumbledore told Harry about the Hallows now? So what if that resolve hardens earlier than canon allows? What if, instead of waiting for Half-Blood Prince, the curse on Dumbledore's hand begins its slow, relentless work at the end of year 5, and forces his hand in a very different way? In canon, he withholds. He lets Harry hear the tale of the three brothers from Xenophilius's lips, lets Hermione frown at the symbol, lets the Hallows remain a riddle that only truly clicks after his death. The Elder Wand, the Resurrection Stone, the Invisibility Cloak. These are fragments Harry assembles while camping in forests and running from snatchers, not truths laid out in a safe office under the watchful gaze of the headmaster who loves him. But imagine a different evening in that same office. Sometime after Sirius has fallen through the veil and the prophecy has been revealed, Dumbledore's hand is already blackened, pain flaring under his sleeve. He has watched Harry shatter in the Department of Mysteries. He has watched, again, what love can cost this boy, and this time, instead of retreating into distance and silence, he calls Harry back sooner. The fire is low, Fawkes is quiet, and Dumbledore says, very simply, there is another story you must hear. We're exploring a Dumbledore who does not wait for a Christmas visit to the Burrow or a final doomed year of lessons. He opens the tales of Beedle the Bard himself, tells the legend of the three brothers, and then does the unthinkable. He admits that the story is not just a fairy tale. He names the Hallows. He admits that the ring which cursed him was both a horcrux and the stone he once dreamed would bring his family back. He lets Harry see, not the flawless chess master, but the young man who once stood beside Grindelwald and whispered about mastering death. What does that do to Harry? This is our pattern interrupt. Up to now, we expect year 6 to be about potions textbooks and a certain half-blood prince. But what if, layered under the hunt for horcruxes, there is this glittering, terrible alternative mission: find the Elder Wand, claim the stone, unite the Hallows. Harry has already lost his parents, Cedric, Sirius. He has already heard Trelawney's prophecy when Dumbledore says, there are objects that might make you unbeatable. How many heartbeats does it take before Harry asks, and could they bring them back? The risk is obvious. Dumbledore knows it because he lived it. Giving Harry the language of the Hallows early might ignite the same obsession that once burned in him. When power meets grief, when legend meets raw, unprocessed love, when a boy who has always been used as a weapon is told there might be a way to finally control his own fate. This isn't a story about simple temptation. It is a story about whether Harry can look at the very thing he has always wanted, his family, his lost godfather, and still walk away. Yet the benefits are just as extraordinary. A Harry who understands both Horcruxes and Hallows is not stumbling blind into Voldemort's endgame. He can recognize the lure of the Elder Wand in Draco's hand, see the pattern in Voldemort's obsession, understand why the wand will never truly belong to the Dark Lord. Most importantly, when the time comes to walk into the Forbidden Forest, he is not just trusting Dumbledore's vague assurances about love and sacrifice. He is making a conscious choice between two philosophies: conquer death or accept it, and that is where the story widens. Because now we can place Dumbledore and Harry side by side, two generations staring at the same myth. One boy once chose mastery and paid with his sister's life. Another boy may choose surrender and save the world. This isn't a story about killing Voldemort efficiently. This is a story about how they each answer the same whispered promise: you do not have to lose anyone ever again. So if Dumbledore lays the Hallows on the table in year 5 or early year 6, what changes when Draco disarms him on that tower? And what, exactly, is Harry walking toward when he finally steps into the trees? Year 6, without the tower, a different Half-Blood Prince, which means that by the time we reach Half-Blood Prince in this timeline, Dumbledore is not a man with 12 careful months on the clock. He's a man who has been dying in secret for years. In canon, the ring's curse gives him roughly a year. Snape slows it, the blackened hand becomes a quiet, terrible countdown, and Dumbledore designs the astronomy tower like a final, precise chess move. But what if he put that ring on in the ruins of the Gaunt shack long before year 5? We're exploring a Dumbledore whose body has been eroding in the background of Azkaban, of the graveyard, of Grimmauld Place. By year 6, the tremor in his wand hand is worse, the fatigue deeper, the pain less manageable. He can still blaze with power when he must, but the recovery is longer, the cost higher, the margin for error almost gone. That changes Draco's story immediately. In canon, Dumbledore can afford to plan a staged death. Draco disarms, Snape kills, the Elder Wand passes, the school is spared a bloodbath. Here, he cannot rely on his curse cooperating to the exact night and second. What if the hand fails in January, not June? What if a stroke, a collapse, a moment of magical backlash takes him in a corridor instead of a tower? This isn't a story about an old wizard choreographing his own martyrdom. This is a story about a strategist trying to build safeguards into a world where his end might be sudden, messy, and witnessed by the wrong eyes. So Dumbledore and Snape have to rewrite the Draco plot. The unbreakable vow still binds Snape to protect the boy, but kill me at the right time becomes be ready to act at any time. Less theater, more triage. Draco's mission may still exist, but Dumbledore, aware that his death might not be a clean sacrifice, could move more aggressively to disarm the plan, to protect Draco's soul before it's even fully tempted. And what about Harry's education? In canon, those horcrux memory lessons begin late, compressed into a single desperate year. If Dumbledore has been cursed since, say, after Chamber of Secrets, does he really wait until Slughorn's return to start? Or does he begin seeding the truth in year 4 or 5, so that by the time the Prince's book appears, Harry already understands Riddle's pattern, already knows that the diary was only the beginning? Most importantly, Harry's role shifts from last-minute chosen weapon to long-term partner in the hunt. Then, there's the cave. In canon, Dumbledore still has the strength to apparate, to drink the potion, to command fire against the Inferi. Now, imagine a Dumbledore who hesitates. Does he still insist on going himself? Or does he bring not just Harry, but another ally, McGonagall, Lupin, even Snape, turning that haunted basin into a small, terrified fellowship? The potion that breaks him might break more than one of them. The Inferi might face coordinated, extraordinary magic instead of a duel of two. And if he can't guarantee dying on his own terms atop the astronomy tower, what happens to Snape's promise? To Draco's almost murder? To the emotional core of that night? If the tower is no longer a controlled sacrifice, but a chaotic intersection of failing body, divided loyalties, and half-finished plans, who bears the weight of Dumbledore's unfinished design, and what does Harry have to become to carry it? Alternate cave, Harry, Dumbledore, and the weight of truth. So when we follow them from that collapsing plan on the tower to the jagged rocks above the cave, the question hanging over everything isn't just tactical, it's mortal. What if this is already Dumbledore's last stand? Not by choice, but by curse, and both of them know it. The sea is a living thing below them, black and heaving, throwing salt in Harry's face as if to wake him up. Beside him, Dumbledore stands with his cloak whipped thin around a body that has lost too much weight, too much time. The cursed hand, already withered and shaking, rises to trace a vast, shining arc in the air. The boat appears, but the magic looks like it costs him. Harry sees it, we see it, and because in this timeline, Harry has heard the prophecy from Dumbledore's own lips and walked through the Horcrux theory with him by firelight, he understands. This isn't just another mission, this might be their last one together. He thinks of the ring, of the way Dumbledore didn't quite meet his eyes when he admitted to a terrible mistake. He thinks of the word Hallows, dropped once and then buried. He thinks of how love and death have always followed this man like twin shadows. Then, he steps into the boat anyway, because that is their bond, unequal in power, equal in resolve. Inside the cave, when they reach the basin, canon folds, and something more profound opens up. The potion gleams, poisonous and still. Dumbledore's voice is firm when he orders Harry to make him drink, but there's a tremor underneath, a knowledge that this curse already lives in his veins. When the first goblet goes down, the pleas begin. In our familiar memory, they are fragmented guilt. Here, they are that and more. Don't leave her, not again. Ariana, please. Gellert, don't turn away. No, not the stone, not yet. Harry, I can't leave him alone. The words tumble, half hallucination, half confession, but Harry, more informed, actually hears them. He knows Ariana's name now, knows the outline of the duel that shattered Dumbledore's family. He knows who Grindelwald is to history, and suspects who he was to Dumbledore's heart. He recognizes the stone not as a legend, but as something Dumbledore has touched, has used, has paid for. Most importantly, he hears his own name in the middle of that storm, and understands that the fear under all the others is this, leaving Harry to finish the war alone. He keeps forcing the goblet to Dumbledore's lips, but his inner world has shifted. This isn't a story about a confused boy obeying orders. This is a story about a young man choosing, again and again, to share the burden, to stay when it would be easier to turn away, when it's over, when the water has been conjured, when the Inferi have fallen back into their frozen grave, when they stand dripping and shaking on the shore of that underground lake. There is a moment that canon never quite allows, a moment where the noise dies, and the truth almost breaks free. Dumbledore leans on Harry far more than he intends to. There are other objects, he manages, each word a rasp, not only horcruxes, things that call to us, the ring, the cloak you wear, and one more. Together, they make... He stops, breath catching on the edge of revelation and regret. Harry, heart pounding, feels the shape of the missing word, Hallows, but Dumbledore closes his eyes. When he speaks again, his voice is soft, almost gentle. No, I have directed your life enough. You will choose your own path, Harry. That is my last gift to you. We're exploring a different connection here. Less chessmaster and piece, more two people walking the same doomed road at different speeds. Dumbledore knows the curse is racing him to the finish. Harry knows the prophecy doesn't promise survival, only confrontation. They are not equals, but they are, finally honest in the ways that matter. And as they rise back toward the storm, and the tower that may no longer be a controlled sacrifice, but a battleground of failing plans, we have to ask, when love and duty collide without a script to follow, what does Harry do when the moment comes? And what if Dumbledore isn't the one who falls? No astronomy tower, mapping Dumbledore's possible deaths. So if the tower is no longer the scripted altar of sacrifice, where and how does Albus Dumbledore actually fall? We're exploring a timeline where the curse is ticking earlier, where the Gaunt ring's poison has already written an invisible deadline under every choice he makes. That means the astronomy tower isn't the only option. It might not even be the likeliest one. First possibility, he simply doesn't wake up. A quiet death in his sleep, in the safety of his own bed at Hogwarts, with Fawkes watching and the portraits waiting. On one level, that preserves the school's fragile stability. There's no dark mark over the castle, no panicked students herded from the corridors, no public humiliation of the only one he ever feared. McGonagall can step in, the Board of Governors can pretend continuity, and the Ministry can spin the story as age and illness rather than open war. But what if that calm is actually a lie that costs them dearly? Harry is left with fewer answers, less closure, no final searing confrontation about Hallows versus Horcruxes. This isn't a story about a boy galvanized by witnessing murder. It's a story about a boy staring at an empty office and realizing too late how much was left unsaid. Second possibility, Dumbledore falls in battle, before or after the cave mission. Imagine Death Eaters ambushing a Horcrux retrieval, or a raid on the Ministry, or even a desperate stand to protect Hogwarts itself. A battlefield death could ignite the Order like a torch. When courage meets grief, when loss meets rage, when the symbol of safety is cut down in open combat, people rally. His death becomes a banner. The cost? Chaos in leadership. Without a carefully staged succession, the Order fractures along old loyalties. Scrimgeour postures, moody snarls, Lupin doubts, and Harry is pulled between them. Most importantly, Voldemort learns faster that Dumbledore is truly gone, and the hunt for Harry accelerates with brutal efficiency. Third possibility, Dumbledore and Snape still arrange a killing, but stripped of theatrical lightning and screaming students. A private tower, a headmaster's office, a sealed classroom. Snape fulfills the unbreakable vow under controlled conditions, with Draco safely nowhere near the line of fire. It's cleaner, colder, less operatic. From Snape's perspective, that earlier vow and longer awareness of the curse cut both ways. Does more time make it easier to accept that he must be the executioner, or harder to live with the waiting? We'll examine how an unwitnessed killing might deepen his self-loathing, even as it strengthens his resolve as future headmaster. No jeering Death Eaters, no shattered boy on the stairs, just a memory he can never share. And without that tower confrontation, Draco's entire arc bends. He never stands with his wand trembling at a defenseless old man, never hears Dumbledore offer protection for his mother, never watches Snape do what he cannot. The guilt that haunts him in canon, the crack that lets remorse in, might never fully form. Does he cling harder to Voldemort out of fear and pride, or drift, unmoored, without that one unbearable moment to measure himself against? In every pathway, one constant remains. Because the ring's curse starts the clock earlier, Dumbledore will die before the final battle. Harry cannot wait for a mentor to script the endgame. He has to step into full agency sooner, to turn love, loss, and incomplete truths into something more profound, something worth fighting for, and to face a war where the last move is finally his. Pattern: interrupt, a Hogwarts ruled by McGonagall and a haunted Snape. So what does that actually look like? On the ground? Not in Harry's head, not in Dumbledore's memories, but in the corridors of Hogwarts itself, once the old chessmaster is gone too soon. Imagine the castle breathing differently. Dumbledore dies earlier, the curse claiming him before Draco's mission, before the Death Eaters have fully threaded their way into the school's walls. In the stunned silence that follows, it isn't a dark mark that defines the sky over Hogwarts, but McGonagall's voice, thin with grief and iron with resolve, accepting the post of headmistress. What if the first power vacuum Voldemort expects to exploit is already partially filled by the one which he has always underestimated? This isn't a story about Hogwarts collapsing the moment Dumbledore falls. This is a story about what happens when someone else steps into that office while the war is still half hidden, when McGonagall has time to organize, to fortify, to quietly rally the staff around a shared promise. The children come first. Now layer Snape onto that, because Dumbledore, dying earlier, has had to be more explicit with him. We're exploring a version of the unbreakable vow, where it isn't just kill me when the time comes, but protect Harry, protect the school, protect them all as best you can. So when Voldemort finally claims Hogwarts and installs Snape as headmaster, he isn't just a double agent. He is a man trapped between two incompatible orders, carrying a love that looks like hatred, and a loyalty that must wear a Death Eater's mask. Can you feel the tension in the staff meetings? McGonagall, nominally deputy now, refusing to leave, insisting on remaining as head of Gryffindor and de facto conscience of the school. Snape, cold and cutting in public, but making just enough concessions in private that she starts to suspect there is something more profound beneath the cruelty. They argue about detentions, about punishments, about the Carrows curriculum. They never argue about whether Hogwarts is worth fighting for. In canon, the Carrows' reign of terror is almost unchecked, and Neville's resistance is born in the cracks left by adult failure. Here, the cracks are narrower. A more empowered McGonagall draws firmer lines. No unforgivable curses on students in her presence, no public crucifixions on the Quidditch pitch, no turning the Great Hall into a daily spectacle of humiliation. Snape, bound by his vow and haunted by Dumbledore's earlier death, quietly backs her in ways no one can quite explain. A detention reassigned, a curse misfired, a terrified first year quietly transferred away from Electo Carrow's reach. Does that mean there is no terror? Of course not, but Neville's arc bends differently. His secret training sessions with Ginny and Luna become less about pure survival, and more about coordinated resistance with sympathetic teachers. Instead of feeling abandoned by every adult, he begins to sense a hidden network. McGonagall's open defiance at the front of the classroom, Snape's shadowy interventions behind closed doors, two broken heirs of Dumbledore's legacy pulling in opposite directions toward the same fragile hope. And most importantly, this pattern interrupt reminds us, an earlier death for Dumbledore doesn't just accelerate Harry's journey, it rewrites the emotional map of Hogwarts itself. The castle is no longer merely a battleground waiting for the final showdown. It becomes an institution actively fighting for its own soul, caught between a headmistress who will not bow and a haunted headmaster who cannot openly stand beside her. So when the final battle does come, what does it mean to fight for a school that has already been resisting from within, together, for so long? Year 7. A Horcrux hunt, without Dumbledore's last will. So when the final battle does come, what does it mean to fight for a school that has already been resisting from within, together, for so long? And what happens when the person who once orchestrated every move from the shadows is gone, long before his last chess pieces are meant to fall? In canon, Dumbledore's will is his final lesson plan, the Deluminator for Ron, a quiet confession that he was seen and trusted, the tales of Beetle, the Bard for Hermione, a riddle disguised as children's lore, the Snitch for Harry, with the Resurrection Stone hidden inside, a promise that, I open at the close, will make sense when the boy who lived is ready to die. Each object is a cryptic guidepost, steering them toward horcruxes, hinting at Hallows, shaping the rhythm of their last year. But in this timeline, what if that carefully curated posthumous curriculum never exists? We're exploring two possibilities, and both change everything. In one, Dumbledore, already marked by the ring's curse years earlier, has been more honest in life, more explicit about horcruxes, more wary of Hallows. When he finally writes a will, it's less poetic and more brutal. Detailed notes on Riddle's past, maps to suspected Horcrux locations, perhaps even the Sword of Gryffindor itself, deliberately passed to Harry, not left to Ministry interpretation. Fewer riddles, more weapons. In the other, darker branch, he dies suddenly. The curse, or an earlier confrontation claiming him before he can arrange anything. No Deluminator, no Beetle, no snitch with a secret. The Ministry still seizes his effects, but there is nothing hidden for Scrimgeour to misread. No last breadcrumb trail for the trio to argue over in the Burrow's sitting room. They walk into year 7 with memories, not mementos. How does that reshape their journey? Without Beetle, Hermione has no neat textual bridge from Children's Tale to Deathly Hallows theory. Without the Deluminator, Ron has no miraculous, canon-perfect beacon to Harry and Hermione in the forest. If he returns, it's by choice, by tracking, by remorse, not by magic designed to forgive him in advance. Without the Snitch, Harry does not literally carry the stone against his heart for months. So either they take longer to connect the Hallows, or if Dumbledore has hammered home the Horcrux mission in life, they ignore the Hallows almost entirely, fixed on destroying the fragments of soul he named for them. This isn't a story about making their path easier. This is a story about stripping away Dumbledore's safety net. Harry, grieving a headmaster who was visibly dying for years and finally actually honest with him, walks into that hunt more determined, but also more haunted. He isn't just following orders. He is finishing something that began the moment a cursed ring blackened an old man's hand. So when he steps into the forest at the end of this war, without a snitch scripted open at the close, is he enacting Dumbledore's plan from beyond the grave, or choosing, finally and fully, a death and a life that belongs only to him? The forest. Again, Harry, the stone, and a different Dumbledore. So when he steps into the forest at the end of this war, without a snitch scripted open at the close, is he enacting Dumbledore's plan from beyond the grave, or choosing, finally and fully, a death and a life that belongs only to him? The forest is the same. That's what hurts. The same dripping branches, the same cold, the same crunch of leaves under his trainers. But the walk is different, because now Harry isn't just holding the resurrection stone, he's holding the history of it. He knows this was the ring that blackened Dumbledore's hand, the curse that set a countdown on the only man Voldemort truly feared, and he knows Dumbledore put it on not for strategy, but for love, for weakness, for Ariana. So when Harry turns the stone 3 times in his fingers, we feel the weight of that choice in a new way. What if he is repeating his mentor's mistake? What if, in calling the dead, he is inviting the same doom that almost swallowed the world when Dumbledore gave in to that selfish longing? This isn't a story about a magical cheat code for courage. This is a story about walking straight into death, fully aware of the cost of wanting the dead to walk with you. They appear as before: Lily, James, Sirius, Lupin, silver and insubstantial, warm and devastating. But now there's an echo in the air, a resonance with all those private councils Dumbledore held with his own ghosts. Harry looks at his mother and thinks of the sister Dumbledore couldn't save. He hears Sirius's laugh and remembers Aberforth's bitterness. He sees Lupin, recently fallen, and imagines Kendra, Ariana, all the faces that must have surrounded Dumbledore when he first twisted that ring and begged for one more moment. We're exploring a parallel here. 2 wizards, both marked by prophecy and guilt, both reaching for the dead when the living still need them. The difference is that Harry keeps walking. He doesn't ask them to stay. He doesn't try to change the bargain. Where Dumbledore clutched at the past until it cursed him. Harry lets the shades be what they are, comfort, not command. And then King's Cross, the white light, the flayed thing under the bench. Canon still holds, but Dumbledore's face is more lined, more honest. He doesn't just talk about love and sacrifice, he starts with failure. He tells Harry, plainly, that when he saw the Gaunt ring, he did not think of horcruxes first. He thought of his family. He admits that his selfish longing nearly doomed everything, that Snape's counter-curse only bought them borrowed time. Harry, in this version, doesn't let that pass. He asks why Dumbledore ever put the ring on when he knew better. He asks why so many secrets, why so many half-truths, why a boy had to piece together Hallows and Horcruxes while the clock on Dumbledore's life ticked down. Did you trust me? He asks. Or did you just need me to finish the plan you started the day you cursed yourself? And for once, Dumbledore doesn't retreat into riddles. He apologizes without excuse. He says he loved Harry, but he also loved the idea of being the one to fix everything, the one to finally master death after failing Ariana. He admits that he used Harry even while wanting to protect him. Most importantly, he asks for forgiveness as a flawed man, not a perfect mentor. Harry gives it, not easily, not blindly, but as someone who has walked the forest with ghosts and chosen to keep walking. He forgives Dumbledore for loving too fiercely, both the dead and the living, and for being brave and cowardly in the same breath. But if Harry walks back from King's Cross carrying that truth, carrying a Dumbledore who has finally confessed everything, what does he do with that knowledge when he faces Voldemort one last time? Endgame tactics. Does Voldemort survive this timeline? Harry walks back from King's Cross, carrying the truth like a second scar. He knows about the Hallows, about the Horcruxes, about Dumbledore's failures and his love. But what if that knowledge lands in a battlefield that has been twisted, stretched, and scarred by Dumbledore's earlier fall? First, we have to count the soul. In canon, the diary is gone in the chamber, the ring in the Gaunt shack, the locket in the cave, the cup in Gringotts, the diadem in the room of requirement, Nagini at Hogwarts, and the piece in Harry himself. Here, with the ring cursed years earlier, Dumbledore hunts faster, but dies sooner. Maybe he still destroys the ring. He knows riddles past too well to miss the Gaunt shack. Maybe, with that same ruthless clarity, he pushes hard on the diary's implications, forcing the Order to accept that this is not a one-off abomination, but part of something larger. But the cost of speed is incompleteness. Without the luxury of a sixth-year investigation, does he ever track the cup to Hepzibah Smith, and from there to Bellatrix's vault? Does he trace the diadem through the story of the lost Ravenclaw relic, or does that thread die with him? We're exploring a timeline where the tally is uneven. Ring and diary certainly gone, locket likely found with creature's miserable testimony, but cup and diadem lingering like landmines, Nagini still coiled at Voldemort's side. Then there is the wand. In canon, Voldemort follows a grisly breadcrumb trail: Dumbledore's death, the theft from his tomb, the legend of the Elder Wand. Here, Dumbledore dies earlier, perhaps not on the astronomy tower, perhaps without Draco's disarming and Snape's killing curse. Does anyone ever become the wand's clear master? Does Voldemort ever learn that the wand he rips from a grave is only half loyal because the chain of defeat snapped in a different direction? If the duel in the Great Hall happens with a wand that is powerful, but not absolutely his, the outcome tilts, but it doesn't guarantee mercy. So does Voldemort survive? Imagine one path where he does. Harry returns from King's Cross, destroys the piece inside himself with that final sacrifice, but when Voldemort falls, one Horcrux remains, an untouched diadem in the rubble of a half-ruined castle, or a cup still buried beneath dragon-guarded gold. The killing curse rebounds, but without every anchor broken, Voldemort's shade clings on, thin and furious. The war staggers beyond Hogwarts into a grim, drawn-out resistance, Harry and the remnants of the Order hunting the last fragment while the world lives in terror of his return. And then imagine the opposite. Dumbledore's early confession forces collective action. This isn't a story about one old man's long game. This is a story about an army of the living choosing to fight together. McGonagall organizes research into riddles past. Hermione cross-references every object tied to his rise. Bill and Fleur crack Gringotts with goblin help. Neville and Luna scour Hogwarts for the diadem. The Horcruxes fall not in a neat sequence, but in a chaotic, overlapping campaign, bloody and desperate, yet more efficient because the secret is shared. In both versions, Voldemort's defeat is still the likely ending, not because Dumbledore planned it perfectly, but because love and sacrifice keep Snape reappearing where his calculations fail. Most importantly, the endgame becomes messier, less choreographed, more fragile. Victory depends not on one master strategist, but on dozens of imperfect people holding the line when the plan breaks. And that raises the real question. When the prophecy feels less like destiny and more like a gamble, what does it mean for Harry to choose that final walk into the forest anyway? Emotional fallout, a world without Dumbledore's long shadow. So what does that choice look like in a world where Dumbledore's hand blackened years earlier, where his long shadow faded before the war ever reached its peak? What if the boy who walked into the forest did it without the echo of a tower fall, without that single, operatic death defining what sacrifice means? Harry's grief in this timeline is quieter, but it cuts deeper. He isn't reeling from the shattering revelation of a man who lied and fell in the same breath. He has had time to watch Dumbledore failing, apologizing, trying. He remembers long conversations in the hospital wing about the Hallows, about Ariana, about the dangers of love twisted into obsession. When he reads Rita Skeeter's half-truths, they hurt, but they don't feel like betrayal. They feel like confirmation of something he already knew, that his mentor was brilliant and broken, selfish and selfless, a man who learned too late how to love responsibly. This isn't a story about idol worship. This is a story about a complicated, tragic love between student and teacher that has room for anger, room for forgiveness, and most importantly, room for Harry to grow beyond him. And then there is Snape. In canon, his memories arrive as a final, desperate data dump, transforming him in Harry's mind only after death. Here, we're exploring a world where Dumbledore's early curse forces him to trust Snape more openly, more explicitly, for longer. Snape spends years as the visible executor of Dumbledore's will, passing guarded hints to the Order, enforcing protections on Harry that everyone can see, bearing the brunt of strategic decisions Dumbledore is too frail to enact himself. When his Patronus glides across the Pensive after the war, it isn't a shocking twist. It is the final piece of a portrait people have been squinting at for years. The greasy, bullying professor becomes posthumously a co-architect of victory, still cruel, still hard to love, but less ambiguous, less easy to dismiss as merely tragic, more obviously something worth fighting for in memory. McGonagall, meanwhile, does not inherit Hogwarts in a single desperate night. She grows into it. From the moment Dumbledore's hand blackens, she starts signing more decrees, chairing more meetings, standing at more podiums. She is the one who studies terrified first years when rumors of Dumbledore's illness spread, the one who negotiates with the Board of Governors, the one who quietly reorganizes the castle's defenses long before the Carrows ever arrive. By the time the final battle comes, no one is surprised when she leads the charge of animated desks and stone knights. They have already watched her hold the school together for years. In this world, she is not just the caretaker who stepped up when tragedy struck. She is the war leader who was always there, finally seen. And what of Dumbledore himself? Without that single cinematic fall, his legend settles differently. The stories children hear are not about a man blasted from a tower, but about a headmaster who walked into a cursed ring knowing it would kill him, who spent his remaining years pouring secrets into other hands. His myth is less about spectacle and more about intention. The wizard who began the fight already certain he would not finish it, who designed a war that could survive his absence. Which leaves us with a hard question. Is a world with less Dumbledore at the center and more shared responsibility in the margins actually healthier in the long run? When no one man is allowed to be the plan, what kind of future does the wizarding world finally imagine for itself? Theme synthesis: love, guilt, and the temptation to control. Because once we pull Dumbledore out of the center, something comes sharply into focus. The Gaunt ring doesn't just change the strategy of the war, it exposes the heart of the man who tried to run it. What if the Resurrection Stone, instead of appearing as a late revelation in Half-Blood Prince, had been whispering to him from the very beginning? The ring doesn't make Dumbledore arrogant, or secretive, or self-sacrificing. Those traits are already there. It amplifies them. It takes his capacity for deep love, Ariana, Aberforth, even the ghost of Grindelwald, and gives it a voice. It takes his buried, crushing guilt and gives it a face. It takes his lifelong temptation to control outcomes, to orchestrate every move so no one else has to suffer, and turns it into a daily, shimmering invitation. In this timeline, that invitation lasts for years, not months. We're exploring a Dumbledore who walks the corridors of Hogwarts with his dead sister at his shoulder, who attends order meetings after Goblet of Fire with the silent presence of his mother in the corner, who debates Snape in that spinning office while the imagined Grindelwald stands just behind him, smiling. How does he tell Harry to accept loss when he himself is secretly refusing to? How does he ask the Order for trust when he's hiding the most intimate, impossible conversations of his life? Most importantly, moving the ring earlier forces those contradictions into his relationships. With Harry, the mentorship becomes sharper, more urgent, but also more haunted. Every lesson about love and death is now tested against the fact that Dumbledore is using the stone to rewrite his own. With Snape, the unbreakable vow isn't just about a cursed hand, it's about a man watching his headmaster cling to phantoms while demanding ruthless clarity in the field. With the Order, his charisma is still extraordinary, but the cracks show sooner. The legend is already fraying while the war is still young, and then we place that beside Harry in the forest. Canon gives us the cleanest possible contrast. One wizard uses the stone in secret, again and again, trying to negotiate with the past. The other uses it once, in a single terrible moment of self-sacrifice, and then lets it fall from his hand. He walks forward without it. He chooses to carry love, but not the illusion of control. This isn't a story about condemning Dumbledore. This is a story about clarifying the moral spine of the saga. Power over death, even for love, even for something that looks like healing, is always dangerous when it becomes a way to avoid the finality of loss. Love that accepts loss, that still turns outward to protect the living, becomes redemptive. By shifting the timing of one mistake, we don't break canon, we sharpen it. We see, more clearly than ever, the fragile human heart beating under the legend, and we're left asking how that heart changes the endgame we thought we knew. Because if Dumbledore has been walking with his dead for years, what happens when Harry finally meets them too? Pattern. Interrupt. 3 alternate micro-timelines in 5 minutes. So let's break our own timeline for a moment. If Dumbledore has been walking with his dead for years, what if we splinter that path 3 different ways? 3 different hearts, making 3 different choices with the same cursed ring. Timeline. A first, Dumbledore uses the stone once, and then stops. The vision of Ariana, of his parents, of a young unfallen Grindelwald is so searing that it doesn't pull him deeper into fantasy, it terrifies him into confession. By the end of Harry's first year, that quiet office talk after the chamber isn't vague reassurance and half-truths. It becomes a trembling admission. Dumbledore actually tells Harry not everything, but enough, that he is dying, that he has made a terrible mistake with a ring, that love and sacrifice are not abstract lessons, but the only reason Harry is still alive. We're exploring a Dumbledore who invites Harry into the burden earlier, who asks, not orders. The mentorship shifts from chess master and pawn to something closer to godfather and ward, a bond where Harry learns, years before the cave, that his headmaster is breakable. That changes every argument in Order of the Phoenix. That changes how Harry walks into the forest. Now snap to timeline B. Same ring, same ghosts. But this time, he doesn't resist. The stone becomes a nightly ritual, a secret addiction. Dumbledore spends more and more time in conversations only he can see, replaying duels that never happened, apologies that come too easily. From the outside, he is still brilliant, still smiling. Inside, he is drifting. Imagine the tower confrontation in Half-Blood Prince with a Dumbledore who cannot quite remember which Severus he's talking to, the real man or the one in his mind who never said always. Imagine strategic errors that look, at first, like bad luck. Horcrux leads misread, the Order sent into traps, Harry left unprepared because Dumbledore believes an illusion of future victory whispered by the dead. This isn't a story about a cursed hand. This is a story about what happens when the wisest wizard we know chooses the comfort of ghosts over the pain of the living and almost hands Voldemort the world. Then timeline C, our third fracture. Dumbledore does what he almost never does in canon. He shares. Early, maybe in the shadow of the third task, he calls Snape and McGonagall into that circular office and lays the ring on the desk between them, blackened and terrible. They see the crack in his hand, hear the truth about the Hallows, the Horcruxes, the curse. Suddenly the plan is not one man's secret, but a triangle of fierce, flawed loyalty. We'll examine a different forest walk, where Harry steps toward death knowing that 3 adults chose this path with him, argued over every step, and still believed in his right to choose. The emotional weight doesn't vanish, it multiplies, but it is shared. Most importantly, these micro-timelines remind us that this isn't a story about a magical artifact dictating fate. It's about choice, about whether Dumbledore clings, collapses, or confides. The ring is constant, the man is not, and that means the end of Harry's story was always more fragile and more open than it looked. So which version of Dumbledore feels truest to you, and which one would Harry actually forgive? Revisiting canon, why Dumbledore's late mistake still hurts. And to feel just how fragile that end really is, we have to go back to canon, back to the ring as it actually was, not as we've been reshaping it. In Half-Blood Prince, the tragedy is that Dumbledore waits. He tracks the Gaunt shack, he identifies the ring as a horcrux, he understands, finally, fully, that Voldemort has anchored himself to the past, and then, at the very moment he is closest to unraveling Voldemort's immortality, he does the most human, devastating thing. He puts the ring on, not as a reckless young man, as an old, world-famous headmaster who has already beaten Grindelwald, already lost Ariana, already watched too many funerals. He knows it is dangerous. He knows it is something Voldemort valued. He knows better, and still, the Resurrection Stone whispers, your mother, your father, your sister, your second chance. In that single, stolen moment of love and grief, he curses himself, and because he does it late, the entire Endgame slams shut around Harry in one compressed year. Snape's unbreakable vow, the cursed hand, the race to find horcruxes, the staged death on the astronomy tower, canon folds all of that into Harry's 6th year. The clock starts ticking only after Dumbledore has laid almost every piece on the board. Our what-if stretches that compression across the whole saga. An earlier ring means an earlier curse, which means every year at Hogwarts becomes a negotiation with a shorter future. Instead of one frantic year where Dumbledore is suddenly dying, we're exploring a world where he has always been dying in secret, where every lesson, every withheld truth, every mission he gives Harry is shaped by the knowledge that his time with this boy is limited. But we have to say this clearly, the canon version still hurts more sharply in one crucial way. Thematically, that late mistake is brutal, because it tells us something more profound about wisdom and love. This isn't a story about a foolish young man learning restraint. It's a story about a wise old man discovering he is not past temptation, that even at the height of insight, grief can still reach through decades and pull you under. When he apologizes to Harry at King's Cross, I cared more for your happiness than your knowing the truth. We already know about the ring. We know he chose the stone. In our earlier timeline version, that apology becomes even more earned, because we've watched him fail in slow motion, watched the curse shadow every choice, watched him try again and again to balance love and strategy and fail at both. Most importantly, this what-if doesn't fix Dumbledore. It magnifies his humanity. It takes that one catastrophic canon moment and lets it echo from Philosopher's Stone onward, so that when you reread Half-Blood Prince, you can hold both timelines in your mind at once. Look at him in those lessons about Voldemort's past. Is this just a general preparing his weapon, or a dying man racing his own regret? When he ignores Harry all summer, is it manipulation, or terror that he has already cost this boy too much? When he drinks the potion in the cave, is he reliving Ariana, or the ring? If you read HBP that way, almost every scene becomes a man negotiating with his mortality, his guilt, and his love for Harry, and the question that lingers is simple. If the ring had come sooner, would he have broken differently, or the same? Hold that question, because next we'll examine what happens when Dumbledore doesn't just break alone, but drags Harry and Hermione into that fracture with him. Character Deep Dive. Snape as the keeper of a dying man's secrets, and if Dumbledore is breaking earlier, he is not breaking alone. He is breaking in front of the one man who has promised to keep his secrets, even as they kill him, Severus Snape. What if Snape's defining burden doesn't begin with that green flare over the astronomy tower, but years before, in a darkened office that smells of potions and singed flesh? In canon, we're told his motivations in sharp, simple strokes. The love for Lily that never fades, the hatred of James that never cools, the loathing of Harry as a living reminder of both, and over it all, this grudging respect for Dumbledore's intellect and moral authority. But here, we're exploring what happens when that respect is chained to something more terrible and more intimate. In this timeline, Dumbledore puts on the Gaunt ring not in the summer before Half-Blood Prince, but much earlier, say, between Chamber of Secrets and Prisoner of Azkaban. The curse explodes through him, the resurrection stone drags ghosts of Ariana and Grindelwald to the surface, and Snape is summoned. That first meeting changes everything. Snape stabilizes the curse, binds it to Dumbledore's hand, and learns the truth. His employer, his confessor, the only man who ever believed he could be more than a Death Eater, is already dying. From that moment, Snape becomes not just spy, but caretaker and executioner in training. This isn't a story about a single unbreakable vow made under Narcissa's tears. This is a story about a long, slow vow, renewed in countless private meetings where Snape measures Dumbledore's pulse, adjusts complex potions, and argues, again and again, about the endgame. How many nights do they spend together in that office? Dumbledore's hand blackening further, Snape's voice low and furious as he insists there must be another way. How often does Dumbledore look at him and say, gently but implacably, Severus, there is not. We'll examine how that repetition carves grooves into Snape's soul. Every dose of potion, every spell that buys Dumbledore one more month, is also one more step toward the moment when Snape must kill the only man who trusts him completely. His resentment deepens, but so does his reluctant affection. He is, in a twisted way, caring for Dumbledore the way he never could care for Lily. And Harry? Harry becomes the axis of Snape's bitterness, because now, it isn't only that Harry is James's face and Lily's eyes. He is the boy for whom Snape is sacrificing his entire life and reputation, year after year, while watching Dumbledore decay. Every time Dumbledore shields Harry, Snape sees not favoritism, but the bill he will one day pay in blood. How do you look at the child who is the reason you will murder the closest thing you have to a friend? How do you teach him occlumency and not scream? Most importantly, this longer descent means that when the unbreakable vow with Narcissa comes, it's almost a formality. Snape has already agreed, in his heart, 100 times, so when we finally reach the pensive in the Shrieking Shack, that last extraordinary reveal is no longer just about Lily, it is a shared eulogy for Dumbledore. The memories of Always sit alongside images of Snape lifting a shaking teacup to Dumbledore's cursed hand, of late-night arguments about Harry's fate, of the quiet, shattering moment when Dumbledore begs for death, and Snape, weeping, agrees. In that vision, Harry doesn't just inherit Lily's love, he inherits Dumbledore's suffering too, and that changes what he does next. But what does Harry do with that doubled grief? And how does Hermione stand with him in the aftermath of such a revelation? That's where we're heading next. Character Deep Dive: McGonagall, the quiet heir to Dumbledore's war. Harry isn't the only one changed by that doubled grief. In the shadows of Dumbledore's office, as the echo of that cursed memory fades, someone else is already bracing for a different kind of inheritance. Minerva McGonagall, the quiet heir to Dumbledore's war. What if, in this altered timeline, where the Gaunt ring is cursed years earlier, Dumbledore doesn't just shoulder the burden alone? What if instead of keeping his endgame locked behind twinkling eyes and half-truths, he finally looks at the one colleague who has always met him without fear, without flattery, and says, Minerva, there is something you must know. Canon gives us the outline, strict but fair, tart as a green apple, yet with that devastating softness when it comes to her lions. She is the teacher who bends the rules so first years can play Quidditch, the head of house who sits beside a petrified Hermione, the deputy who faces Umbridge with a spine of steel. She has always been fiercely protective of her students, of Hogwarts itself, of Dumbledore. But here, we're exploring what happens when that loyalty is not just emotional, it's strategic. Dumbledore, hand already blackening from the Gaunt ring's curse, begins to share more than he ever does in canon. Not everything at once, that's not who he is, but pieces. The existence of horcruxes, the fragility of his own life, the reality that the chessboard he has been arranging will outlast him. In quiet, late-night conversations over cold tea, he starts grooming her as his successor, not only as headmistress in waiting, but as the future leader of a war. How does that change McGonagall? For one, she pushes back harder, earlier, against ministry interference, Fudge's paranoia, Umbridge's decrees, even Scrimgeour's political games. Meet a woman who knows time is bleeding out of Dumbledore's veins. She invests more in student safety because she understands that the children in her care are not just pupils, they are the next wave of resistance. Secret dueling training for prefects, contingency plans with trusted staff, quiet instructions to Flitwick, Sprout, and Pomfrey about what happens if Albus is delayed. This isn't a story about a school running on autopilot. This is a story about a fortress being quietly readied for siege, and then he dies. Not at the end of Half-Blood Prince, but earlier, when Harry and Hermione are still learning what love and leadership mean together. McGonagall's grief is volcanic, but it has to erupt in private. In public, she becomes stone. She walks into the Great Hall, voice steady, gaze unshakable, and holds the school together by sheer will. Most importantly, she becomes the emotional center Dumbledore can no longer be, for the staff, for the Order, for two teenagers who have just watched their last great mentor fall. She listens to Harry's guilt without indulging it, challenges Hermione's plans without belittling them, and anchors the Order when old members waver. When legends fall, someone has to guard what they stood for. In this timeline, McGonagall finally inhabits the role many of us always felt in our bones. The true guardian of Hogwarts' soul. But if she is the guardian, then how do Harry and Hermione, now burdened with Dumbledore's secrets and McGonagall's trust, choose to fight the war he left behind? And what new lines are they willing to cross together? Harry's arc, rewritten from pawn to partner to heir. Harry and Hermione walk out of McGonagall's office not as protected children, but as inheritors of a broken war, and this is where the earlier Gaunt ring changes everything. It rewrites Harry's arc from the very beginning, from pawn to partner to heir. In canon, Harry starts as the classic piece on Dumbledore's chessboard. First year, kept ignorant about the stone. Second year, thrown into the Chamber of Secrets with only fragments of the diary's truth. Third year, Sirius's fate dangled in front of him, then ripped away, while Dumbledore withholds the full story of Pettigrew and prophecy. We watch the pattern harden. By the time we reach Order of the Phoenix, Harry's disillusionment explodes in that office scene. The shouting, the smashed instruments, the raw question under all the rage, why didn't you tell me? But what if Dumbledore, already cursed and already counting his remaining months, cannot afford that distance? We're exploring a headmaster whose blackened hand is not a late revelation on the Astronomy Tower, but a quiet, shaking confession in Grimmauld Place, or even at the end of Goblet of Fire. He shows Harry the ring's ruin, admits the Hallows, admits Ariana, admits that love and ambition once made him dangerous. Suddenly, this isn't a story about a boy manipulated from the shadows. This is a story about two people, one young and one old, choosing to carry the same unbearable truth together. Year 5 shifts first. Harry's anger doesn't vanish. How could it, with Sirius dead and the prophecy revealed? But the target changes. Instead of seeing Dumbledore as the omnipotent adult who abandoned him, he sees a frail general already half in the grave, terrified of repeating his own past. The shouting is still there, but beneath it runs something more profound. Grief at losing the only mentor who ever actually admitted he was wrong. The wild emotional swings flatten slightly, the core wound deepens. Year 6, with Dumbledore's death accelerated by the ring, becomes Harry's forced apprenticeship. No leisurely year of private lessons and half-truths. No illusion that there is always more time. Dumbledore lays out Horcruxes and Hallows on the table like a will, not a riddle. He trusts Harry with the whole, terrible picture, and, most importantly, with his failures. Snape's mission, Grindelwald, the Gaunt shack, the stone. Harry learns it all earlier, and that knowledge is both a gift and a burden. By year 7, the difference is stark. Harry doesn't stumble into leadership at the Burrow or in the tent. He has already been practicing it since Dumbledore's earlier fall, already making decisions with Hermione as a true partner rather than a secret-keeping subordinate. When he walks into the forest, it feels less like a sudden leap and more like the final step in a long, painful apprenticeship. The heir claiming not just Dumbledore's wand, but his love, his mistakes, his impossible standard of mercy. So no, this what-if doesn't make Harry's life easier. It makes his agency clearer. He is not just the victim of Dumbledore's design, but the conscious heir to a flawed legacy, something worth fighting for, and maybe worth changing. But if Harry steps into that role earlier, if he and Hermione become strategists rather than confused survivors, what happens when their clearer agency collides with the darkest choices of the war, and who do they decide they're willing to sacrifice? Ethical question: is earlier honesty worth the extra pain? He and Hermione may choose to stand as co-strategists, but that only sharpens the next question. How much truth does a dying general owe the child he's sending into battle? What if the Gaunt Ring's curse starts burning through Dumbledore, not in Half-Blood Prince, but shortly after the Chamber of Secrets, or even Azkaban? Suddenly, every quiet talk in his office is no longer an old wizard's leisurely chess game, it's a countdown, and that changes the ethics of silence. Do you protect a boy's fragile innocence, or prepare him for an extraordinary trauma you know you won't live to see him through? In canon, Dumbledore waits. The full prophecy comes late, in the shattered office after Sirius's death. The Horcruxes are a vague mission until the cave. The Hallows are a fairy tale, dripped out in cryptic hints and half-confessions. But in this altered timeline, with the curse already creeping up his arm, we're exploring a very different pattern, an earlier confession in that same office, not about everything, but about something. There is a piece of Voldemort in you, Harry. There is a prophecy. There are objects anchoring his soul, and I am running out of time. Imagine the contrast. Fifth-year Harry in canon, lashing out because no one trusted him, versus a fifth-year Harry who has already heard the prophecy from Dumbledore's own lips, who has actually seen the blackened hand, and been told plainly that the headmaster is dying. The nightmares don't wait for Voldemort's possession. They come from knowing he is marked, that his mentor is on a clock, that every moment with Hermione and Ron might be borrowed. The anxiety spikes, the sense of destiny grows heavier, but so does his agency, because this isn't a story about sparing Harry pain. It is a story about what kind of pain he carries, and when. Early honesty means he loses the illusion of a safe Hogwarts much sooner. It also means he doesn't lose his faith in Dumbledore quite so violently later. No shattered pedestal in King's Cross, no sense that his entire life was a manipulated lie, because the man who loved him chose to speak before death made that impossible. So does the curse itself create a moral obligation? Once Dumbledore knows he will die, whether Snape can slow it or not, does he owe Harry the truth as a form of respect? Not every detail perhaps, but the core, the prophecy, the horcruxes, the Hallows not as riddles, but as a dangerous, tempting path he must refuse. If your death will already wound someone you love, are you required to at least let them meet the real you, not the curated headmaster mask? Most importantly, what does that question say about us? When we think about our own lives, parents shielding children from divorce, friends hiding diagnoses, partners softening hard truths, where do we fall? Would we rather live longer in a gentler illusion, or shorter in a harsher reality that lets us choose, act, and love with open eyes together? As we follow Harry and Hermione through this altered war, we'll examine not just what Dumbledore should do, but what we actually want from the people who hold our hearts and our secrets. Meta-analysis. Why this what if feels so intimate, and that brings us to why this particular divergence hits so hard. We're not just changing a clue, or a duel, or which spell lands first. We're changing the moment Dumbledore reaches for the Gaunt Ring, the instant he finally decides that seeing his family again is worth the risk. What if the chess master moves his doomed piece years earlier, and every lesson Harry and Hermione receive is haunted by that invisible countdown? Fans have always argued over who Dumbledore really is. Is he the benevolent grandfather who gives sherbet lemons and second chances, or the cold strategist who raises a boy for slaughter? In this timeline, we're exploring a version of him who cannot hide behind time. The curse is already eating through his hand, through his plans, through his composure. He is still kind, still brilliant, still manipulative. Only now, the contradictions are magnified until we can't look away, because when we shift the ring earlier, we expose the emotional logic behind decisions that, in canon, can feel almost abstract. Why does he delay telling Harry about the Hallows? Why does he bind Snape with an unbreakable vow and withhold the full truth even from him? Why does he cling to the idea that Harry must die at the right moment, in the right way? If the Resurrection Stone has already confronted him with Ariana's face, with his mother's disappointment, with Grindelwald's shadow, those choices stop being purely tactical. They become the contortions of a man trying to atone on a shrinking timeline. This isn't a story about proving Dumbledore was secretly a monster, or secretly a saint. This is a story about how a single altered choice drags every buried motive to the surface. We'll examine how the same man who arranges Harry's death can, in the same breath, press his hand to a cursed ring because he still, after everything, wants one more moment with his sister. Does that make him unforgivable or unbearably human? Perhaps both. And that's the deeper appeal of what if narratives in a world we love this much. They let us test the elasticity of characters without breaking them. When we move the ring, what remains constant? Dumbledore's belief in love as the oldest magic, his terror of power, his refusal to trust fully, even the people he claims to love. When chaos meets logic, when guilt meets brilliance, when a dying headmaster meets two teenagers who always insist on the truth, something more profound emerges from the familiar plot. Most importantly, this scenario feels intimate because it is built on grief, love, and the impossible wish to hold the dead again. The Resurrection Stone is just a spellbound metaphor for what so many of us would do if offered one more conversation, one more apology, one more chance to stand together as a family. Dumbledore's flaw is not alien, it is ours, made extraordinary and dangerous. So when we ask what if he put on the ring sooner, we're joining a long tradition of transformative readings that don't cheapen canon, but press it. We ask harder questions of Dumbledore, of fate, of responsibility, not to tear the story down, but to find something worth fighting for inside it. And as we step into the next phase of this timeline, into a Hogwarts quietly ruled by a man already dying, the real test begins. What changes, and what refuses to change, no matter how early the curse starts ticking. Soft landing, walking back from the ruins to the Great Hall. So we leave that version of Hogwarts, the one ruled by a man already dying, and for a moment we go back to where it all began. The ruined shack, the rotting boards, the gaunt ring lying in the dust like a trap laid by history itself. A younger Dumbledore reaches out, hand trembling, past and future screaming at him through that cracked black stone. In our timeline, he slips it on too soon, and everything detonates. But watch what happens if we let that image dissolve. The cursed light fades from his fingers, the shack blurs, and we return to canon, to a Dumbledore who does not yet yield, who walks away from the ring and leaves that terrible choice for much later, when Harry is almost grown and the board is nearly set. That shift, early temptation versus delayed surrender, is where our whole thought experiment has lived, and it is a thought experiment. This isn't a story about replacing canon or proving that Rowling's version is somehow lacking. This is a story about pressure testing what we already love, about asking what if in order to see the original lines more clearly. The books on your shelf have not changed, but maybe the light in which you read them has, because once you've imagined Dumbledore haunted by the ring from Harry's first year, how different does King's Cross feel? When he tells Harry, "I am so sorry," when he finally lays bare the Hallows, the Horcruxes, the childhood he tried to bury, those words carry a new weight. We can almost see the earlier Dumbledore we invented, the one who failed faster, standing behind the canon Dumbledore, who waited, who tried to learn, who actually did manage to give Harry the choice he once stole from his own sister. Even his small, quiet moments change. The twinkling jokes at the welcoming feasts, the way he protects Harry after the Chamber of Secrets, the soft trust when he says in Order of the Phoenix that he cared too much. After walking through an alternate world where he is already marked for death, that quiet humor feels less like whimsy and more like defiance. That final trust in Harry, the decision to leave the last, hardest steps in the hands of a boy he loves, is no longer just strategy, it becomes something more profound. And once we see that, how can we not turn the question toward ourselves? What if one conversation had happened earlier in your life? What if one apology had not been delayed for years? What if a single secret had stayed buried or been dragged into the light? We're exploring Dumbledore, yes, but we're also circling around the way one moment of honesty or cowardice can ripple outward through everything. So as we walk back from the ruins to the Great Hall, it feels like leaving a long feast. We have argued together, grieved together, held this flawed old wizard up to the light together. The candles are burning low, the benches are emptying, and the corridor outside is warm and familiar again. But before we step fully back into that comfort, there is one last question we have to face about Dumbledore, the ring, and the choice he never escapes, no matter when he makes it. Recap: the 5 biggest changes in this timeline. So what if we step back from the candlelight and look at this altered history, not as scattered scenes, but as a single, reshaped arc? If Dumbledore puts on the Gaunt ring years earlier, the first and deepest change is inside him. Instead of the distant mastermind of canon, holding his secrets like chess pieces, we get a headmaster already marked, already haunted, already speaking to the dead in corridors no one else can see. His guilt over Ariana, his broken love for Grindelwald, his longing for his parents and brother, all of that bleeds through sooner. He is still brilliant, still dangerous, but the mask slips earlier. Harry, and we, actually see the man who is afraid of his own reflection. Change number 2 unfolds in the way Hogwarts itself learns to breathe without him. because once Dumbledore knows the curse is eating him, he cannot pretend to be the only general in this war. McGonagall is pulled into his confidence not in 6th year, but far earlier, asked to shoulder command decisions while he is still alive to argue with her. Snape, bound by the unbreakable vow and his impossible love, is not just the assassin-in-waiting of canon. He becomes Dumbledore's daily partner in triage, strategy, and lies. Their bond curdles and deepens at once, and Harry is caught between them, sensing that there is something more profound going on than simple loyalty or simple betrayal. Third, the timeline of secrets collapses. The Gaunt ring forces Dumbledore to confront Horcruxes and Hallows in the same breath, so the careful pacing of canon shatters. We're exploring a world where the diary, the ring, and the locket are not scattered mysteries, but part of an explicit pattern much earlier, where the Deathly Hallows are not a late fairy tale, but a live question in Harry's 5th or even 4th year. What happens when the boy who lived is told, years ahead of schedule, that there is an Elder Wand, a resurrection stone, a cloak that is already his, and that Voldemort is hunting at least one of them? That leads directly to change number 4, Harry's psychological journey. This isn't a story about a pawn who only learns the rules once the game is almost over. This is a story about a boy dragged into the war as a partner, then slowly, painfully, as an heir. Earlier knowledge means earlier agency, but it also means that his trust in Dumbledore fractures sooner. He has more time to love the flawed man, more time to resent the manipulation, more time to build his own ethics around death, sacrifice, and the Hallows. His grief, when it comes, is less about abandonment and more about inheritance. And finally, change number 5, the shape of the war itself. With Dumbledore's death moved forward, the Battle of Hogwarts cannot hinge on a single wand, a single duel, a single long game. Only one mind understood. Leadership decentralizes. McGonagall, Kingsley, Lupin, even the DA step into roles they never quite held in canon. Victory, if it comes, is messier, more collective, less about one extraordinary wizard, and more about many ordinary choices converging. Most importantly, it asks us whether that shared burden is actually something worth fighting for. So where does that leave Voldemort, the Hallows, and the Last Stand in this timeline? That's where we'll go next. CTA, your turn to rewrite the Wizarding War. That's where we'll go next in the larger series. But for this moment, the story is in your hands. What if this timeline doesn't end where we've paused it? What if instead of one fixed version of events, we let Dumbledore's choice with the Gaunt ring fracture into a dozen different paths, each one revealing something more profound about who he is and who Harry becomes? This isn't a story about passively watching canon from a distance. This is a story about all of us stepping into the map and drawing new lines together. So, your turn. In your version, when does Dumbledore put on the ring? Is it a desperate, lonely moment right after he finds the Gaunt shack? Or does he wait until after Sirius falls through the veil, unable to bear that loss without reaching for the stone? Tell us where you'd place that choice, what he actually does with it, and which single scene you'd most want to see reimagined. Do you want to watch him walk the grounds with Ariana at his side? Face Grindelwald's memory before the duel ever happens? Stand in the headmaster's office with Harry while the dead he loves gather around them both? Let's go even deeper. Should Dumbledore have told Harry about the Hallows earlier, when the ring first scars his hand, turning every lesson into a countdown? Or do you believe his silence is still necessary, even with death closer than in canon? How do you see Snape handling the curse if it strikes in, say, Chamber of Secrets or Order of the Phoenix? Does he become more ruthless, more protective, or more broken? And in a Hogwarts that loses Dumbledore years ahead of schedule, what role does McGonagall play as the steady center? Is she the open, fiercely honest headmistress Harry always needed, or the iron backbone that refuses to let the school fall while children lead the war? If you want more angles to work with, we're exploring other Dumbledore. What if scenarios and companion videos? What if he never sought the Hallows at all? What if his duel with Grindelwald ended differently? What if Snape's redemption arc took a path where he chose Harry openly instead of from the shadows? We'll examine the ethics of the Deathly Hallows themselves, whether any of them can be used in love without corrupting the one who wields them. If this kind of rewiring of the Wizarding War speaks to you, you can stay in the conversation by liking, subscribing, and sharing this with someone who also rereads these books searching for new lines of connection. Every comment, every theory, every quiet disagreement helps us build a community that treats these stories as living, not finished. Because in the end, it's not the Hallows or the Horcruxes that change the world. It's what we're willing to risk for the people we love in any timeline. Final image, the ring left in the dust. And then, for just a moment, we leave the debates and the timelines and the theories behind, and we go back to where it all began. The Gaunt shack is quiet. No phoenix song, no flash of spellfire, no headmaster in half-moon spectacles standing in the doorway, heart pounding at the sight of a familiar symbol. In this last imagined frame, the ring lies where it fell decades ago, half buried in dust and ash, the resurrection stone sleeping in its cracked setting. Dumbledore has been here in this what-if, has traced the air above it, has felt the old craving rise like smoke in his chest, and then he has walked away. No curse blooms black on his hand, no desperate bargain with Snape, no countdown quietly threaded through Harry's 6th year, just a ring, untouched, in a house that remembers too much. The camera in our minds lingers on it, on that dull gleam in the half-light, on the way one small enchanted circle can hold a whole lifetime of regret and temptation. Then we pull back, from the ring to the splintered table, from the table to the peeling walls and the broken door, from the shack to the tangle of trees that hide it, to the lane where no one walks, to the sky above Little Hangleton, and then further still, Hogwarts rising in the distance, Grimmauld Place sealed and waiting, a boy in a cupboard dreaming of something more. The wizarding world turning, completely unaware that in one version of events, a single choice was made, and the echo of it runs through everything, because this isn't a story about a perfect general making a flawless plan and then slipping once. This is a story about a deeply flawed man who always wanted too much power, too much control, too much reassurance from the dead, and who still, somehow, kept trying to choose love over fear. Dumbledore's tragedy is not that he fell from grace, it's that he never actually stood that high to begin with, and yet he kept reaching for something worth fighting for. When we ask what if he had put on the Gaunt ring sooner, we're exploring more than alternate tactics and rearranged battles. We're examining the thin line between wisdom and cowardice, between letting go and holding on so hard that the past cuts into your skin, and most importantly, we're holding up a mirror to every moment we wish we could call someone back, say one more thing, ask what they might have done differently. Stories are their own resurrection stones. We turn them 3 times in our hands when we reread, when we rewatch, when we rewrite. We call characters back, we argue with them, we forgive them, we refuse to forgive them. We imagine them making another choice and feel the ache of how close it always was. In that sense, Dumbledore walks beside us every time we return to this canon, every time we dare to love a flawed mentor and still question him. So let the final image be simple, a ring left in the dust, and a world built on the choices we make without it. No triumphant music, just a quiet line, almost a whisper, as if from an old man in a funny hat who has finally learned how to let go. Do not pity the dead, Harry. Pity the living, and above all, those who live without love. And then, silence.